Tariffs. The term has become completely impossible to avoid in the news lately. And you're not alone if it's left you scratching your head. What is a tariff? How do they work? Who pays them? And how will the US's potential new tariff platform affect you in your day-to-day life? You don't need a degree in economics to understand all this. You just need to sit back and pay attention to this episode of the Infographics Show, and you'll understand exactly how all of this will impact your wallet. So, let's start with the basics. What are tariffs? Thankfully, it's not actually that complicated. Tariffs are a special tax placed on imported goods from other countries. They're added directly to the price of goods as the import takes place. But what does that mean in practical terms? Let's say you're in the market for a new car. You can't decide whether you want a BMW imported straight from Germany or a Chrysler right from here in the US of A. The prices of the cars themselves are competitive, but why do you end up paying more for the imported Beamer? It might be because of a tariff on imported cars. But maybe we need to think a little bit bigger than that. Maybe you're not an average consumer. Maybe you're a company based in Silicon Valley, ready to create the next big thing in tech. But to do this, you're probably going to need microprocessors. They're required for everything from smartphones to washing machines, after all. Taiwan isn't just an island in the Pacific, it's the microchip capital of the world, responsible for over a third of all global production. But if there's a tariff on tech from outside of the US, the costs might rise so high that your tech company will need to start exploring deals to build microchips right here in the US. This is how tariffs can affect not only whole products made outside of the US, like the BMW, but items manufactured in the US that are made from parts abroad, like the ambitions of our tech company. Still with us? Good. Now let's take a closer look at why countries use tariffs, because this is crucial to understanding why a government might want to put them in place. There are 3 reasons why a government might choose to impose a tariff: revenue, protecting domestic businesses, and as a political incentive against another country. Revenue is the most straightforward of the 3. The government wants to collect taxes to fund its own initiatives, so a higher tax on imported goods makes for more government revenue, especially if the tariffs aren't high enough to force companies to shift to US-based production. But if the taxes are severe enough that domestic companies consider a change, then the tariff might have been imposed to help protect domestic workers and manufacturers. The rise of economic globalization has led to a lot of US industries, from tech to textiles, outsourcing their manufacturing work to other countries, often in Asia. This not only encourages unethical labor practices like sweatshops to keep the manufacturing costs low, it also ends up affecting workers and companies in the US. Take, for example, the automotive industry that was once the lifeblood of Detroit, Michigan. Outsourcing automotive manufacturing, the move toward automation, and the increasing popularity of foreign cars moving into the US auto market had a ruinous effect on D-Town. Theoretically, imposing stronger tariffs would have helped both companies and consumers support domestic automakers and prevent their jobs from being outsourced overseas. And then there's the strategic political element. Tariffs might be a tool to help address a trade imbalance, also known as a trade deficit. This is a situation where a company is importing more than it's exporting, meaning it's perhaps built an over-reliance on foreign goods. However, trade deficits aren't necessarily a terrible thing. The US has actually run on a trade deficit since the 1970s, and the impacts of this rarely have a considerable effect against the average consumer. But still, if a government wants to address a trade deficit manually, then tariffs are a pretty good start. Making it more costly and inconvenient to import parts and goods encourages consumers to shop local when they can, giving exports a chance to keep up while imports falter. But this is an internal political strategy. What if you want to use tariffs to affect other countries with economic leverage? Tariffs can be used punitively, somewhat like a less severe approach to an economic sanction where trade with a sanctioned country is outright forbidden. Increasing tariffs against a particular country's imported goods can hurt them economically, and this can be used as a bargaining chip for wider trade or political negotiations. We've often seen this between the US and China from 2018 to 2020. So that is what a tariff is, and a few reasons why a country might use them. But there are a few much more serious and important details we need to get into now. How do these tariffs actually work? Who do the extra costs get passed on to? And how might some of the planned tariffs we're seeing in the news right now affect your wallet? First, let's address the how. Let's look at 2 different types of tariff and how they work. Type number 1 are specific tariffs. This is a fixed extra fee applied to an import, which will stay the same regardless of how much that import costs. Let's return to your BMW you were thinking about importing. If the government imposes a $2,000 specific tariff on auto products from Germany, you'll be paying $2,000 whether you're buying a $40,000 BMW X1 xDrive 28i SUV or a $120,000 BMW M850i. So that's specific tariffs. Then there's the other type, ad valorem tariffs. These added costs are expressed as a percentage of the value of goods. For example, a 10% tariff on fruits and vegetables grocery companies import from abroad, keeping the tariffs proportional to the specific goods. At first glance, tariffs might seem like a win-win. They protect local jobs and reduce dependence on foreign economies. But the reality is, tariffs can have a hidden side. Despite their good intentions, they often come with unintended consequences that can ripple through industries, raising costs and impacting consumers in ways we don't always expect. One of these consequences is making domestic industries worse. Without the competition of international trade keeping them on their toes, domestic companies might become an oligopoly, less accountable to the demands of their customers. After all, it's not like they can just go shop somewhere else. Less competition can also have another nasty effect for consumers. Without competition, no competitive pricing, meaning that consumers don't even end up saving money. On an international scale, like any political strategy, tariffs as a means to exert economic leverage on other countries could backfire. Rather than getting the concessions they want, the other party might just impose tariffs right back in retaliation, resulting in a trade war that ultimately just hurts both parties at once. We saw this again from 2018 to 2020, when the US imposed heavy tariffs against goods from EU member states and China. This resulted in a number of retaliatory tariffs against US products from bourbon to Harley-Davidson motorcycles. But what does getting hurt by a tariff actually mean? To answer that question, we need to ask ourselves another. When tariffs get imposed on goods, who actually ends up footing the bill? Well, to put it simply, you do. That's right. It's a huge oversight to think that the country exporting goods ends up paying extra. The purpose of tariffs is to make foreign goods more expensive for you, the consumer. It's a way to disincentivize you from buying those foreign goods and instead shopping domestically. Now, this sounds like a pretty simple plan in an ideal world, but a quick look out your window and at your bank account reveals none of us live in an ideal world. Lower-income consumers are often the ones most impacted by tariffs. They're already working with more limited options for where they can shop for basic necessities, including everything from food to bottled water to toilet paper. If the more affordable foreign goods end up being made more expensive by tariffs, people without much money to spare will end up paying more either way. You might think that small businesses would benefit from a rise in tariffs compared to huge multinational companies that heavily invested in international manufacturing. Well, the truth isn't actually that simple. In our modern globalized economy, small businesses may just be as likely to benefit from imported goods and parts. Without the same resources as their larger counterparts, a sudden rise in tariffs might throw their business into disarray. Tariffs might sound simple in theory, but in practice, the gap between their intended benefits and the actual impact can be significant. We've already discussed the theory at length here, but let's take a look at the practice for consumers and businesses. For consumers, a sudden spike in the price of imported goods can feel like inflation with no escape. In regions of the US that are heavily reliant on these imports, they're often left footing the bill if domestic alternatives aren't already available. Without the infrastructure to support replacements, many are simply forced to absorb these higher costs. And what about the businesses that need to acclimate to a high-tariff world? They're left with only three options. The first is to carry on as normal and simply swallow the costs. This is inconvenient but doable for larger companies and potentially ruinous for smaller ones. The second option is to increase prices in order to maintain profit. This obviously doesn't benefit the consumer either, because they end up swallowing the costs. The third option is to uproot their current business practices and try to find a domestic supplier, which will be both complicated and time-consuming. This brings us all the way back to the most important question of all. How will the proposed new US tariffs affect the consumer? As we mentioned earlier, the United States has run on a trade deficit since the 1970s. It's a country that relies heavily on imported goods. In fact, in 2023, the US actually imported $3,100 billion worth of goods. This made up around 11% of the country's gross domestic product. That same year, tariffs brought in the government revenue of $80 billion, which accounted for only about 2% of their overall tax revenue. The most popular imported goods include crude petroleum, cars, broadcasting equipment, computers, packaged medicaments, motor vehicle parts, and accessories. There's also refined petroleum, vaccines, blood, anti-sera, office machine parts, and integrated circuits, all things that the US would benefit from reliable access to. The planned tariffs range from a 20% ad valorem tax on general imported goods, a 60% tariff on Chinese goods, and even a 200% tariff on foreign autos. So, you can kiss that BMW goodbye, unless you're willing to pay twice its price on the tariff alone. In the interest of fairness, one possible outcome of these tariffs is a boost to domestic production. And if the foreign exporters are desperate enough to keep customers in the United States, they could lower their prices significantly to offset the potential price hike from the imports. However, while this isn't impossible, it is highly unlikely based on tariff precedents. Between 2018 and 2020, when tariffs were hiked across the board, studies into the matter have shown that the costs were ultimately passed on to the consumers rather than improving the life of the average American. Will things be different now? Well, the University of Chicago asked a panel of economists whether they agreed with this statement. Imposing tariffs results in a substantial portion of the tariffs being borne by consumers of the country that enacts the tariffs through price increases. 98% of them agreed. The Peterson Institute for International Economics suggested that the proposed tariffs would lower the income of the poorest portion of Americans by 4%, and even the wealthiest Americans by 2%. And if that wasn't a bad enough deal already, multiple economists have speculated that the tariffs will cause another spike in inflation. Not to mention, things will get even worse if some of the affected countries, which have considerable trade relationships with the US, like China or Mexico, decide to institute retaliatory tariffs of their own. Claims that the tariffs will protect U.S. manufacturing jobs also don't seem to hold water either. In 2018, the U.S. introduced a 25% tariff on imported steel, but over the course of the tariff's employment, a net 4,000 jobs in steel were still lost. The rise in American steel prices didn't just affect steel producers, it sent shockwaves through other industries that rely on steel for manufacturing. From car makers to construction firms, many were hit with soaring costs, and the result was painful. There were job losses across the board as businesses struggled to stay competitive. Even if you're not buying expensive imported cars or importing steel for factories, you are still likely to feel the pinch at your local grocery store. Common ingredients like garlic are often imported from China, which will be heavily impacted by the 60% proposed tariff. Supply chain issues and a lack of availability will likely follow while new trade partnerships are brokered. And because of the lack of competition, you might still experience higher prices even when new supply chains level out. Whether any of this will make the US government change course on their tariff plan, we'll just have to wait and see. The United States wakes up with millions of people getting ready to play a role in the economy. From the workers keeping the retail sector running to the stockbrokers handling huge amounts of money, everyone plays their part. But today is no ordinary day, because today is the day the US economy begins to collapse, and it'll happen sooner than anyone knows. That's not to say an economic collapse happened out of nowhere. There are warning signs all around, and many economists have been trying to tell people for a long time. Inflation has likely been high for a long time, bordering on hyperinflation. When money has less value, the price of goods and services goes up too, and as salaries rarely rise with them, it becomes harder and harder to afford even basic goods. The economy might have been slowing down in growth as well, with many people on unemployment. The combination of these two factors leads to a condition called stagflation. This puts the government in an unfortunate bind, as the methods needed to lower inflation might lead to higher unemployment. It's a bad state of affairs, but the dam is about to burst. The stock market is the method most people use to gauge the health of the economy. If it's doing well, people are likely to keep investing, but when there's a sudden lack of investor confidence in the market, it can go downhill in a hurry. And it doesn't take much. If a major player suddenly goes bankrupt or a bad economic or global news drops, people start selling their stocks. Tension over current political affairs, like the pending vote to raise the US debt ceiling, only makes things worse. When some people start selling, others follow suit, and the snowball effect starts. Easy to get started, hard to stop. And that's where the panic starts. In a matter of hours, billions of dollars are lost in the US economy. Major companies see their stock value drop precipitously, some losing much of their net worth. And let's not forget about the billionaires. Many of them, like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, have their net worth heavily tied up in stock holdings. That means they lose and gain billions of dollars while sleeping, and today they might just see half their net worth disappear into thin air. It's a disaster for everyone from the billionaires to the small investors who see their retirement savings go up in smoke. Many companies see their entire net worth disappear, and by the close of the trading day, countless people are out of work and facing an uncertain future. But it's only going to get worse from here. Day 2. The US government is in a panic. This is the worst day for stocks since 1929, even eclipsing the chaos caused by the Great Recession of 2008. They know something needs to be done, providing aid to keep the economic collapse from getting worse. That's what happened in both 2008 and 2020. After the stock market collapse in 2008, a costly bailout bill was proposed, giving many of the businesses who were about to fold an infusion of cash. And in 2020, as the stock market collapsed due to the coronavirus pandemic, the government provided both aid to businesses who were shut down and direct payments to Americans who were out of work. That should work again, assuming the Republicans and Democrats can work together. No big deal, right? Not this time. A hurried bailout bill designed to stop the stock market collapse is voted down by a narrow margin, with some on the far right not wanting to spend taxpayer dollars and some on the far left wanting a more robust bill. The result is a further loss of confidence in the U.S. economy, complete with a stock market slide to match. It's starting to look much less like a recession and more like depression, and people around the world are paying attention. The stock market has lost more than 10% of its value in only 2 days, and everyone who relies on the U.S. government for money is starting to get worried. That includes Americans and those abroad. The U.S. government runs a deficit, a massive one, and many of those dollars are owed abroad. The U.S. national debt right now is a whopping $30 trillion, and as the U.S. economy continues its free fall, that'll have a global fallout. The U.S. dollar declines in value quickly, and many of the creditors are worried they'll never get their money back. So some might decide to call in their debts while they can, to which the U.S. might start by saying, "I'm good for it, man, I'll pay you next week." But it's not just the big economic players who feel the damage created by the collapse. As businesses shut down due to the stock crash and resulting bankruptcies, more people start to find themselves out of work. They worry where their next meal will be coming from, and what would happen if society breaks down as a whole. As night falls on the United States for the second time in the midst of a massive economic collapse, many people look at the news and say, "We better get out there tomorrow and pick up some supplies, just in case." And that might just make things worse. Day 3. The start of the trading day is 9:30 a.m. and most people heading to the stock market floor look like they're heading to an execution. No surprise, things look grim from the moment the trading starts, but elsewhere there's already chaos. Grocery stores around the country are seeing a surge in buyers, emptying shelves similar to the way they did in the early days of the pandemic. The sense of uncertainty has driven people to worry about shortages, and that means they're going to create those shortages themselves by stripping the shelves. Soon news footage starts coming out and it's not good. Because when people are in a panic, they act out. The first footage shows 2 old women brawling over the last pack of eggs. Next, a video comes out of a man punching out a supermarket manager because she tells him they've run out of meat. Shots of people looting and running out without paying are common, and robberies in the parking lot start cropping up as well. By the time evening falls on the US, several major supermarkets and big box stores have been looted, which means they aren't going to be open tomorrow. But hey, at least they're not on Wall Street. The overall losses have fallen to around 20% of the overall stock market in only 3 days. The panic has grown to an apocalyptic level, and people are starting to ask, should the stock market open tomorrow? Historically, major events have led to temporary halts in trading. Assassinations of presidents, outbreaks of major wars, collapses of major businesses have led to shutdowns, and the 9/11 terror attacks led to a 6-day halt. Temporary halts prevented massive sell-offs during the coronavirus shutdown, but it couldn't stop the damage. Stock market halts can also be triggered at 3 thresholds: -7%, 13%, and 20%. And as the market crosses the 3rd threshold, powers that be say shut it down. So the stock market won't lose any more dollars tomorrow. But will that solve the problem? Day 4. People have started realizing this is bad, and it's not going to get better anytime soon. Much like the last morning's panicked grocery shopping, people are worried about another shortage today: money. Most people don't keep much cash on hand, instead keeping all their money in the banks and relying on credit cards to do much of their shopping. But the fear makes people seek out something a little more reliable, so they head to the bank and do some larger than usual withdrawals. And once again, they're far from the only ones. Footage comes out of lines snaking in and out of bank drive-thrus, clogging traffic. Many people are withdrawing their entire life savings, and banks are running out of cash on hand, forcing them to turn people away. As it becomes clear that this panic isn't abating, many banks start to put withdrawal limits to avoid having to close down and to make sure everyone maintains some access to their account. It could be worse. During the Great Depression, many banks went under entirely, and many people lost their life savings as a result. Since then, banks have been insured by the government to prevent that from happening again, as long as the US government is in semi-functioning order. And that's not something we should ever question, or is it? With the government failing to pass a relief bill, the president has been reduced to passing executive orders. He's tried to unlock some emergency funding, but his powers are limited and the bleeding doesn't seem to be stopping. He's ordered the leaders of both parties back to the negotiating table to hash out a bipartisan bill, but both have come to the table with their own demands and aren't in a compromising mood. Making things worse, he spends most of the day fielding angry calls from other world leaders. They've been watching the news and they're concerned about what they're seeing. Is the US economy on the verge of collapse? Right now, everything's in a holding pattern, but it's about to get worse. Day 5. The scariest thing about Day 5 of the American economic collapse isn't what's happening, it's what isn't happening. The stock market is staying shut, and no one seems in a hurry to open it again. Many of the banks that dealt with the cash rush yesterday are staying closed too, with some making people arrange meetings to do withdrawals in person or putting strict limits on the amount that can be taken out. Many smaller banks are just keeping their doors closed and not allowing anyone to withdraw money. Grocery stores are reinstating pandemic-era policies, only letting a small number of people in at a time, and by the time people do get in, most of the shelves are empty. But they say there's no scarier words than, "I'm the government and I'm here to help." Congress wasn't able to pass a relief bill yet, but they're still negotiating. Debts are coming due, and countries outside the US are starting to wonder if the US has a handle on things. They don't, but the president doesn't want everyone else to know that. The first priority is an infusion of cash to start paying off bills, and the best way to do that is by printing a lot of money. An executive order has the Federal Reserve putting cash on the printer, and the US is able to take care of some pressing issues. But that has a nasty side effect, diluting the US dollar and contributing to an already brutal inflation number. We're not quite at Zimbabwe level yet, where they printed billion-dollar bills and people needed to show up to stores with wheelbarrows of cash, but economists are getting nervous. And a far bigger crisis might be just around the corner. The United States debt ceiling is the key to keeping the machine running, and the US usually runs a heavy debt. And when they don't have the money on hand to pay for something, they just borrow more. The government sets a limit on the amount of debt the country can carry, and periodically they have to vote to raise it. That deadline is sneaking up fast, and while the congressmen are debating on what a relief bill should look like, this might be an even more pressing concern. Because if the debt ceiling doesn't get raised, the US defaults on its debt, and that's when things get really bad. Day 6. Congress has been called back to vote on raising the debt ceiling, and the whole country and the world is watching with bated breath. If they pass the bill, the US will be able to find some creditors to tide them over until the economic crisis passes. If it fails, default will come almost immediately on a segment of non-bond US debt, further undermining confidence in the economy and sending not just the US markets, but the world markets into a panic as the world's largest economy continues to convulse. With the stakes high, surely a clean bill can be passed to give the debt ceiling a temporary boost, or at least pass a temporary dispensation, right? Nothing's ever so easy in Congress. It's clear the tensions from the relief bill are spilling over from the minute the debate begins, with multiple congressmen stepping up to raise objections to the bill or offer amendments that are only loosely related to the matter at hand. Arguments fill the halls of the House of Representatives, and making things worse, the controlling party only has a 5-seat margin, with around 10 hardline members who often disagree with leadership. They need 218 votes to pass raising the debt limit, but the final bill has multiple poison pill amendments that have angered both the base and radicals. And when the vote roll is called, it falls short with only 210 votes. And the entire world watches, as the United States is about to default on a portion of its debt as of midnight. Around the world, in stock markets that are still operating, people start selling off their shares of American companies. The American dollar continues to decline rapidly, and the exchange rate becomes brutal for Americans looking to spend money outside of the country. And around the world, various powers start to sharpen their knives as the US looks weaker than it's been in over 100 years. Could this be the end of the United States as a great power, or will it be another economic bump in the road? A whole lot of people are waiting to find out. Day 7. As the economic crisis enters its first full week, the president is not happy. He's already called up the leaders of both parties, reading them the riot act, and then watched with dismay as the clock rolled over and America officially was unable to pay its debts. He spent the rest of the early morning on the phone with allies, assuring them this was only a temporary problem and they'd get their money in short order. Some, like most of Europe, were understanding, although rumblings in the streets of Europe was that doing business with America was not a good proposition right now. But other countries were less understanding. China, the single biggest US creditor, wasted no time, and reports started circling the globe of outposts of US companies being placed under Chinese control and US ships being detained at Chinese ports. The president had several tense phone calls with Chinese leadership, but the Chinese were cagey and wouldn't admit that there was an official policy of seizing US assets, although they wouldn't deny it either. And in the throes of a massive economic crisis at home, the US wasn't looking to add an international crisis to that. So the president had little choice but trust China's word and slink away quietly. Back on the home front, things were about to go from bad to worse. A week into the crisis, many companies were struggling with a massive cash flow problem. Many owners had seen their company's value drop like a rock or had problems getting the cash they needed to grow their business. Expansion plans were put on hold, planned loans were canceled by timid lenders, and thousands of small and mid-sized businesses had seen their narrow profit margin disappear and were forced to close up shop when it was clear they would not be able to make this month's rent. And that put tens of thousands of new people out of work and on the unemployment rolls, causing massive backlogs in the systems. Tensions are rising and people don't know where their next paycheck will come from. That's a recipe for a tinderbox about to explode. Day 8. One area hasn't suffered much in the economic disaster: social media. As the pandemic grows, everyone with access to the internet is using social media to vent and make their own suggestions for what to do, and everyone seems to hate every other idea. Political tensions are higher than ever, and everyone seems to agree on one thing: it's the government's fault. All it takes is one spark to make things boil over, and this comes when a video goes viral of an interaction at a supermarket. An old woman with a basket of groceries finds that her credit card has been declined and is roughly handled by security when she begs them to let her take the food anyway. That sparks a brawl in the store, with customers brawling with security and later police. The footage spreads around the world in a matter of hours, and the public is not happy. It starts as localized riots around the scene of the initial fighting, but soon people in cities and suburbs around the country are taking to the streets. Some are ransacking supermarkets in a stepped-up version of the initial food wars. Others are taking their frustrations out on government buildings, looting stores, or brawling with the authorities in the streets. The police are out in force, trying to maintain order, but some find themselves outnumbered, and others aren't interested in fighting with ordinary Americans in a panic over the economy. The public feels like the government isn't doing anything, and that's something that cuts across all political lines. And one figure is taking more of the heat than anyone else. When a mob of protesters starts gathering at the White House, the Secret Service keeps an eye on it nervously. After all, protesting is legal. But when they start approaching the fence and tossing things over it, they spring into action. The Secret Service quickly tries to disperse the crowd, but several agents are injured by tossed bottles. They fight back, arresting some protesters and injuring others, and the president is quickly ushered down to the White House bunker. The crowd is eventually dispersed, but it's clear something has unleashed, and it's not going away anytime soon. And the rest of the world has noticed too. Day 9. The footage of American cities and suburbs in flames has gone viral around the world, and the president has given a shaky speech from the bunker calling for peace. To put it lightly, it didn't raise anyone's confidence about the state of things. States have begun calling up the National Guard to restore order, but reports are coming in of guardsmen refusing their orders. After all, they might be facing off against their own loved ones, and many of them are also looking at their bank accounts, terrified of what's happening. Even more businesses choose to close down after last night, some suffering serious damage in the unrest, and others not wanting to expose themselves to the riots if they kick off again. And some radical solutions are being proposed. So what's more important, the United States' economic health or the country staying a democracy? Powerful members of both parties have called for the president to declare a state of emergency and take extreme measures, including seizing the assets of some of the country's most powerful billionaires. After all, those several $100 billion might come in handy. Of course, they probably can't agree on which billionaire should be first in line. Probably the one they disagree with the most. But one isn't waiting to find out. Word starts getting around that Elon Musk took a private plane to Canada overnight, where he still has citizenship. And he's not the only one losing faith. Word starts spreading around the world of more and more American assets being seized by other countries. It continues in China, but other less powerful countries are joining in. Even the US's allies in the EU and the Anglosphere are sounding increasingly agitated about the situation, demanding answers from the president as the US dollar keeps inflating and the political situation gets increasingly volatile. Around the country, those well-versed in financial matters decide to get what they can while the dollar still has some value, and many try to trade their cash in for commodities with a solid value, like gold. But will gold even be worth anything in the event of a complete economic collapse? Day 10. Most people have lost faith in the United States' ability to pull itself out of this economic crisis anytime soon, and it's looking more like a full-on collapse than a recession or depression. The dollar has plunged to an all-time low around the world, thousands of businesses close by the day, and the public is in a panic. The president addresses the nation again, announcing emergency executive orders keeping the stock markets closed and instituting strict limits on cash withdrawals to prevent another bank run. However, he doesn't announce any of the far-reaching radical moves some wanted, although many say it's just a matter of time. All around the world, a massive ripple effect begins to emerge. Even the US's closest allies see a grim trend. Pending details with American companies are called off, ongoing projects are put on hold, and branches of American businesses abroad start to shut down due to the contraction of the US economy. Many online markets stop taking the dollar altogether because it's too volatile to make a reliable currency as it declines by the day. The seizure of American businesses and ships in less friendly countries continues, but the U.S. is too preoccupied to care at the moment, and many American citizens abroad start to head home. Not that home is looking all that inviting. As the public starts to prepare itself for a prolonged economic crash and possibly a total collapse, what'll they need? The hoarding we saw in the first days wasn't exactly productive, but longtime preppers have a plan for the worst-case scenario. They're stocking up on food with a long shelf life, water filters to ensure a supply of clean water, clothing for the winter, tools including axes that will allow them to cut wood for fire and serve as a weapon in a pinch, first aid kits, battery-operated radios, and flashlights in case the power goes out. Most of these are worst-case scenario items for total societal collapse rather than an economic collapse, but who knows where we're headed. Is there a way out of an economic collapse? That heavily depends on what the government does. Some countries like Venezuela and Zimbabwe doubled down on faulty policies that led to hyperinflation and greater isolation from the world. Others like Argentina were able to rebound from defaulting on their debt by negotiating with their creditors and restructuring their debt. It was a long, hard 4-year depression, but they eventually started rebounding economically and came out of the default. They just needed to work together and establish savvy policy. Good luck with that, Congress. Watching the news is kind of like watching a horror movie sometimes, especially when it comes to economics. First, you hear the USA is applying 10% tariffs. Suddenly, Starbucks raises the price of coffee. Then 20%. Your local seafood restaurant is all out of shrimp. In your darkest nightmares, it could go as high as 40 or even 50% tariffs. You can't even order Dos Equis at a bar. But just because we think it's fun to spike your blood pressure, let's get a little bit crazy. What if the US imposed 100% tariffs on the rest of the world? Would it usher in a new era of American independence and economic prosperity? Or would it send us all more in the direction of the Hunger Games or the Purge? On today's episode of the Infographic Show, we'll explore the America that 100% global tariffs would create and how that would affect you at home, at the grocery store, and in your wallet. Better watch closely and hope our predictions don't come true. Before you start firing off comments about fear-mongering, just know this isn't America's first rodeo when it comes to unleashing the economic nuclear option of 100% tariffs. In 1987, the U.S. pushed the big red button for the first time against the Japanese auto market. A 100% tariff was put on $300 million of Japanese imports, with a particular focus on cars. This was a classic example of a retaliatory tariff. We'll get into that later, after the U.S. wasn't happy with Japan's conduct in a 1986 semiconductor trade agreement. It happened again in 1993, not long after the EU formed. The EU put a tariff on bananas from Latin America to give banana businesses in Africa and the Caribbean a chance. This wasn't a popular decision in the U.S. because most of the banana companies in Latin America were owned by American companies, thanks to some shady tactics from the CIA. The U.S. claimed that the EU tariffs were against free market principles and took their grievances to the World Trade Organization. But just to emphasize the point, the U.S. threw in another retaliatory tariff of 100% against a huge number of EU imports, from French Brie to Scottish Cashmere. In May 2024, as part of a large battery of tariffs, the U.S. levied another one of those dreaded 100% tariffs against Chinese-manufactured electric vehicles. The hope was that it would bolster the U.S.'s own electric vehicle production. Then, in early December that same year, right after the U.S. elections, the incoming administration didn't waste any time. It threatened 100% tariffs against the members of the BRICS nations: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Iran, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, and Ethiopia, if they tried to move the global currency away from the dollar. These are all isolated examples of 100% tariffs being used by the U.S., and they give us a place to start with exploring today's scenario. But you might need a little refresher. Most people won't actually stop to explain what tariffs are, or even the fact that there are two different types of them. This all really matters for you to understand what happens next. Tariffs are added costs that the government imposes on imports, goods brought in from other countries. These costs aren't paid by the other country. That's a common misconception. They're actually paid by the people or companies in the U.S. that are arranging the imports. If Target is importing tomatoes from farmers in Mexico, and there are tariffs on Mexican goods, it'll be Target that's paying extra. Still with us? Good. The really important thing to know, especially when it comes to the percentages we're throwing around here, is that there are two types of tariffs: specific or fixed tariffs and ad valorem tariffs. Specific tariffs are a flat tax put on an import, which would be consistent regardless of the amount you're bringing in. Take those tomatoes from earlier. That tariff might be theoretically $1,000 per shipment on tomatoes. But much more important are the ad valorem tariffs. That's Latin for according to value. These charges are calculated as a percentage of the product's value. A 10% tax means every product's value would be divided by 10, and that result is added on top of the cost. Ad valorem tariffs can be applied to specific products, like cars or beer or agricultural products, or as a blanket tariff to all products coming in from an entire country. Under ad valorem tariffs, the more products you import, the more expensive they are, and the more you'll end up paying to bring them into the country. And under the dreaded 100% tariff, anyone importing goods would effectively, literally be paying double for the goods they import. And that's a pretty big incentive against doing it. The most obvious thing that tariffs into the US will affect is imported goods, whether they end up in your fridge, your cabinets, your computers, or in your garages. And seeing as food is the most essential product of all, let's start there. Ready to take a trip down to the grocery store? Nearly a fifth of all food consumed in the US comes from abroad, and that number is climbing. In the first 11 months of 2022, Americans spent almost 20% or more on imported food than the year before, racking up a total of $182 billion. Between 2007 and 2021, the share of imported produce surged from 50% to 60% for fruits and from 20% to 38% for vegetables, excluding potatoes, sweet potatoes, and mushrooms. Under complete global 100% tariffs, you are looking at two possible scenarios. Either grocery stores will pass along the doubling costs to you, making certain products prohibitively expensive, or they will drastically reduce imports or stop them entirely, meaning that certain goods will disappear from the shelves for vast portions of the year, just like the British experienced after the post-Brexit supply chain disruptions. And the UK is a nation with only 68 million people. Could an economically isolationist country with 346 million mouths to feed provide the supply to meet the demand? So let's get practical and find out, which products will you be feeling the squeeze on? Maybe you like to start your morning with a delicious and healthy source of around 80% of hack jokes about millennials, avocado toast. Now there's a lot to love about avocados. They're healthy, tasty, and versatile, giving you everything from the aforementioned avo toast to the delicious guacamole in your favorite burrito. There's a good chance that some of you are getting hungry just listening to this. It's also something we rely heavily on our neighbors to the south to satisfy our Joneses for. The U.S. buys up 86% of the avocados Mexico exports. While you can grow avocados in some parts of the U.S., like California, it's not nearly as easy as it is down south. The U.S. imports from $2.1 to $3.6 billion worth of avocados every year, 16.7% of America's total imported fruits, which both fill a lot of toast slices and burrito wraps, and it is the largest proportion of imported fruit in the country. But would a tariff hike mean this creamy green gold vanishes from American shelves forever? Thankfully, no, but it would hit both price and availability hard. California avocados would be scarcer than their Mexican equivalents, leading to increased demand and, by the laws of trade, increased price. You'd also need to go without your delicious avocado fix being satisfied during the winter months. In the U.S., avocado season is from February to September, and a ripe avocado will spoil in generally less than a week. Under 100% import tariffs, you would have to tolerate dry burritos and plain toast from October till the end of January every year. In Mexico, avocado season is all year round, so your craving can be forever satisfied by the ones that Mexico exports up north. And avocados are just a small slice of a bigger picture when it comes to fruit and vegetable imports. The globalization of trade, the very system the U.S. would be pulling back from with 100% tariffs, is the reason why you can enjoy fresh produce year-round instead of being limited to the short U.S. growing season. But avocados are really just the tip of the iceberg for how Americans' access to food would suddenly become extremely limited, especially during the winter months. According to some sources, America imports $2.6 billion of bananas each year, mostly from South America. Grapes come up just behind at $2.4 billion, which it goes without saying will also affect wine production for all our aspiring sommeliers out there. The same goes for cranberries, bilberries, raspberries, blackberries, and mulberries, each of which is imported at around $1.9 billion annually. We're cumulatively also looking at several billion more from lemons, limes, pineapples, mangoes, mandarins, tangerines, melons, and frozen strawberries. Without all those, it goes without saying, your kitchen fruit bowl is looking a lot less stocked. You're probably going to be running low on a whole host of essential vitamins, especially in the winter months when you need them the most. But hey, at least the US doesn't rely a great deal on foreign imports for their vegetables too, right? Right? Okay, you probably already figured out where that was going. Vegetables are another thing the U.S. desperately needs supplies from both Canada and Mexico to meet the national demand. From Canada, the U.S. imports hundreds of millions in mushrooms and potatoes. From Mexico, there's tomatoes, bell peppers, cucumbers, cauliflower, broccoli, asparagus, onions, lettuce, and spinach. One group that might actually celebrate the 100% tariff plan are 6-year-olds who refuse to eat their veggies, at least until vitamin deficiencies and constipation catch up with them. Of course, you might just wonder, could reducing reliance on imported fruits and veggies simply push the U.S. to grow more domestically? In theory, maybe, but just like with the humble avocado, many of these crops aren't even practical to grow in American climates, and even fewer can be produced year-round. And this would all be bad enough if the U.S. was just levying tariffs against Mexico, Canada, and China, which accounted for around 45% of the United States' food imports in 2022. But economically, shutting out imports from the entire world would be utterly devastating. Already, 28% of American adults say that they have difficulty buying food, and 13.5% of households claim to have difficulty getting access to food. And with a food price hike and product shortages, this would only get much worse. We're sorry to tell you, it's also much bigger than just fruits and vegetables. All agricultural imports have been on the rise in the U.S., with the growth of agricultural imports slowly outpacing the growth of agricultural exports, despite the latter historically being larger than the former. The USDA Economic Research Service had forecasted that in 2025, the U.S. will be operating on a $42 billion agricultural trade deficit. Don't worry, we'll explain more about deficits later. But suffice to say, the projected agricultural trade deficit for this year is the largest in the U.S. in the last 3 decades. And the bigger the deficit, the more infrastructure that'll collapse in light of a sudden 100% universal tariff. While fruit, vegetables, and nuts imports are pretty dire, if you're a seafood fan, well, it's gonna get even worse for you. In the last few years, 70 to 85% of seafood consumed in the U.S. came from international sources. In 2020, the U.S. had a $17 billion trade deficit when it came to seafood. Almost $2 billion of that was frozen shellfish from countries like India. So scaring off those imports would lead to a sudden seafood shortage in the States. We can expect riots in Boston after that if people can't get their hands on a lobster roll all year round. Speaking of that lobster roll, you won't be happy to hear that the U.S. annually imports more than $10 billion of breads and pastries, mostly from Canada. So the roll your imaginary lobster is nestled in is actually in trouble too. Fresh beef supplies are also supplemented by Canada, with frozen beef supplemented by Australia. If all of this economic doomsaying is making you thirsty, you might find yourself wondering, what about beverages? If you're sober and you just prefer water or soda, you'll be fine. But if you like your drinks a little stronger, it might unnerve you to know that the U.S. imports around $6 billion of beer. That's in addition to the $5 billion of liquor and cordial, and over $2 billion of flavored water, all mostly from Mexico. Billions of dollars in wine, sparkling or otherwise, as well as brandy and vodka come largely from European nations like France. And what about America's favorite drink of all? Coffee. The only places in the U.S. where it can be commercially cultivated are in California, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. To keep up with the demands of a coffee-addicted populace, the U.S. imported almost $1.5 billion of coffee in 2023 alone, mostly from Brazil. We don't know about you, but the idea of even a week of a coffee-free U.S. is kinda terrifying. How would people survive? And then there's fuel costs. A lot of anxiety in the world right now comes to the prices you have to face at the pump. But in a 100% tariff world, it gets so much worse. In 2023, the United States imported 8.5 million barrels of petroleum. And no, we don't mean annually. That's how much was imported per day that year. Petroleum is one of the pleasant things that the U.S. has a trade surplus of, but regular consumers and larger infrastructure would be utterly kneecapped by the loss of these imports. What about other commodities and industrial goods? The U.S. heavily relies on imports here too. As of 2019, we were looking at $54.6 billion in organic chemicals and $60.8 billion in gems and precious metals. There was also $61.9 billion in plastics, $72.1 billion in furniture, lighting, and signs, $93.4 billion in medical equipment and supplies, and $116.3 billion in pharmaceuticals. That's before we mentioned the $306.7 billion in vehicles and automobiles, $367.1 billion in electrical machinery, and $386.7 billion in overall machinery, including computers and hardware. All of this incorporated together, the US has a $600 billion trade deficit. Now, just imagine the hole it would leave for all of those carefully balanced trade relationships to collapse under the sheer weight of a sudden 100% tariff. It's a little concerning, to say the least. Okay, let's take a little break from the chaotic post-ultra tariffs America that this direction would create. Don't worry, we'll go back there soon. Let's explore why exactly a government like the US applies tariffs in the first place. One of the big reasons is, of course, retaliation. If you don't want to go as far as sanctioning a country, whether they're an ally or an enemy, putting tariffs on their goods is one way to punish another nation. That's exactly what we saw with the tariffs on Japanese imports in the late 80s and the tariffs on EU imports in the early 90s. But this is a double-edged sword. There is no certainty that people on the receiving end of tariffs won't just levy tariffs back at you, which can potentially start an escalating trade war. And we'll get into how exactly a trade war would affect the ultimate economically isolationist America later, but suffice it to say, it would not be pretty. Stay tuned for that. Of course, another good reason to institute tariffs, in theory, is to supplement tax revenue. Before federal income tax was introduced in 1913, revenue from tariffs actually made up as high as around 95% of tax income for the U.S. government. While the share of revenue the U.S. collects from tariffs has declined over the years, a cash-strapped country might see higher tariffs as a way to shrink its trade deficit. And in case you were wondering, trade deficits are when you import more from a country than you export to them. In some cases, running a trade deficit can give the other country economic leverage over you, which is not ideal. But the biggest reason you'll generally see tariffs implemented is to protect U.S. industry and manufacturing. That was the case for the 2024 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. The aim was to prevent those imports from undercutting electric vehicle manufacturing domestically. It's a truth universally acknowledged that large publicly traded companies have a fiduciary duty to keep their profits high. A key part of that endless quest is keeping costs low, often by sourcing cheaper materials and labor from abroad. One way for a government to gently convince them otherwise is to alter their economic incentives. If a clothing or phone company is manufacturing its products with cheap, and often, let's be real, ethically questionable foreign labor, adding tariffs on these makes this choice far more costly. In an ideal world, this means that the companies will return to the now comparatively reasonable domestic sources to reduce their overheads. It's kind of like using corporate greed for good for once. But the best-laid plans often go awry, and as you're soon going to find out, tariffs made with good intentions to protect American industry can sometimes end up doing just the opposite. As we mentioned earlier, one of the U.S.'s major reasons for levying tariffs is retaliation, applying economic leverage to get the outcomes that they want out of geopolitical spats. But this goes both ways. When the U.S. threatened Canada, Mexico, and China with high tariffs in early February 2025, the U.S. was met with immediate reprisals. Canada hit back with 25% tariffs on a range of U.S. goods, everything from makeup to drinks, dealing a blow worth an estimated $20 billion to American exports. Unsurprisingly, these tariffs were soon put on pause. But let's be real, tit-for-tat trade wars wouldn't just stop there. If the U.S. went all in with a universal 100% tariff, escalation would be inevitable. And if history, both economic and military, has taught us anything, it's that the more battles you fight at once, the slimmer your chances of securing a win. If the U.S. imposed a universal 100% tariff, it would instantly turn itself into a hermit nation. Its import network would collapse overnight. But that's only half of the story. Key U.S. exports would face an onslaught of retaliatory tariffs, wiping them out in a trade war spiral. As of 2023, the U.S. was exporting $323 billion in mineral fuels, oil, and distillation products. The second highest export was machinery, nuclear reactors, and boilers, at $233 billion per year. Electrical and electronic equipment accounts for just over $200 billion, and a combination of vehicles and air and spacecraft combined to account for a little less than $300 billion. These are all industries where the U.S. currently excels, but it isn't unique by any means. Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Canada export more oil. China is a larger exporter of electronics, and also the largest exporter of cars. While the U.S. is the world's top exporter of aircraft, buyers would not be left stranded. France, Germany, the UK, even Canada could step in to fill the gap. And that is just the start. Medical equipment, pharmaceuticals, plastics, organic chemicals, food. One by one, America's key exports would find new suppliers. So why would the United States drive its most important trade partners away, potentially to its own horrific detriment? All we can hope is that our strange little prediction of a 100% universal tariff never becomes a reality. Would a universal 100% tariff make America stronger or send the economy into a tailspin? Would you be willing to pay higher prices for American-made goods? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Now, it's been a bang-up couple of years for the people here on Earth. First, the world got rocked by a global pandemic. This caused a 3-month economic recession as global industry came to a screeching halt. With people in quarantine all around the world and COVID deaths piling up, a bit of good news came our way when in September 2020 it was announced that Keeping Up with the Kardashians was finally being canceled. However, just as COVID started to wind down and the world could once more breathe a sigh of maskless relief, Russia decided to become the turd in the punch bowl by invading Ukraine and sending global markets reeling once again. And if that wasn't bad enough, 3 weeks after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Kardashian family returned with a brand new Hulu reality series. But things would only get worse from there as the world began to reap what it had sown during the COVID pandemic. Global inflation is at highs not seen in nearly half a century, with inflation in the US reaching 8.58% as of the making of this video, a high previously reached in 1981. This staggering rise in inflation is driven largely by increasing costs of food and energy due to the slowdown of both industries during the COVID pandemic. Food prices increased by 12.6% just between February and March of this year, the highest level of inflation since 1990. Wheat and other grains were hit especially hard thanks to the war in Ukraine, with costs rising by 17.9% thanks to the direct effects of the war and a Russian embargo on Ukrainian shipping. As both Russia and Ukraine grow much of the world's wheat and other grains, the war has had devastating effects on commodity prices. Ukrainians have had their fields destroyed or mined by Russian troops, and what wheat has been able to be harvested has either been stolen by Russian troops or blockaded by Russian ships in the Black Sea. The situation is growing so dire, especially for poorer African nations who face a pending famine, that there has been a growing call in the West for Ukrainian trade convoys to be escorted by NATO warships to break through Russian blockades. The Russians would face a choice with significant consequences: take on the superior NATO fleets and broaden the war exponentially, or allow Ukrainian grain to be shipped abroad, ending the threat to African nations and lowering food prices around the world. The world's ravenous appetite for goods has also fueled this historical inflation. Coming out of lockdowns and quarantine starting in late 2021, billions of people flooded stores all over the world with money they'd saved up during the quarantine. People everywhere were hungry for life, and the resulting surge in demand has caused a sympathetic surge in prices. Lastly, energy prices have skyrocketed in recent months thanks to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Like a perfect storm, all these factors have come together at exactly the worst time, when people were ready to pick up where they left off before the pandemic. Sanctions against Russia and disruption in Russian oil supplies has led to a sharp jump of the price in oil. Worsening the situation was the refusal by OPEC nations to increase production to offset Russia's disruption. For OPEC nations such as Saudi Arabia, the ever-increasing oil prices are an economic windfall, and they're making money hand over fist as the world suffers. Thankfully, and likely because nations like Saudi Arabia were reminded who really provides for their national defense against enemies like Iran, American President Joe Biden was able to negotiate an increase in oil production by OPEC, which should lower prices in the coming summer months. So, how do you survive the coming recession? First, calm down. Recessions aren't permanent. Even the Great Depression only lasted several years before an economic uptick, leading to the most prosperous era in U.S. history. While World War II helped, an end to the Depression was inevitable, and so is an end to this recession. With the average recession lasting 11 months, you should try to keep a perspective and not fall prey to what investors call FUD, or fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Governments around the world are hiking up interest rates in order to help combat rising inflation. What this means is that loans for big-ticket items such as houses and cars will now come with greater interest rates, so you end up paying more. This is how central banks primarily fight inflation, as higher interest rates means consumers are less likely to spend money, which can in turn reduce demand for goods and bring prices back down again. So for the time being, don't plan on buying a car or a brand new house. This is the time to save and wait for the end of the recession, during which historically economic growth booms and interest rates come back down again. If you're an investor, this is probably a time of great fear. Traditional stocks have taken a severe beating, with the S&P 500 officially entering a bear market, or a 20% drop from the most recent high. This has wiped out billions in value across the entire stock market, causing some portfolios to crash. If you invest in cryptocurrency, you're no doubt feeling this pain as crypto has lost over $1 trillion in value since March 2022. The bottom seems to be nowhere in sight, as even Bitcoin, the largest cryptocurrency, has lost over $60 billion in market capitalization in the last few months. The collapse of some altcoins, most famously Luna, has led to many to fear the crypto market only worsening the situation as new investors are scared away. But bear markets aren't necessarily bad for investors if you can stick it out for the long run. Remember, you don't lock in any losses until you sell. And unless you have a solid reason to believe your investment is headed in the single digits, you should fight the urge to sell and cut losses. Instead, it might be time to refocus priorities and shift investments into different assets. Consumer goods, healthcare, and energy are always solid investments during bear markets, as these things are vital to the average Joe and will likely see less loss. In fact, you might even get a small return in the midst of a bear market. People need critical consumer goods, no matter what their financial situation is. If you're a crypto investor, you might be better off simply throwing your money directly into a dumpster. Just kidding. It's time to reevaluate what projects you're backing financially and refocus from more risky assets to more tried and proven assets. Major coins such as Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Solana are unlikely to go under given their widespread adoption. People want to use these coins, and while still very risky, there is an inherent less risk in a well-established cryptocurrency than in your cousin's altcoin he airdropped to you last week at Starbucks. A good way to determine what coins are likely to survive this crypto crash is to look at total market capitalization. This will tell you what coins people are using or holding. Whether you invest in traditional investments such as stocks or riskier options such as crypto, the key during a bear market is to avoid trying to time the market. Stop looking for the bottom, believing you can get in at a dirt cheap price and make a killing on the bounce back. It's time to stop chasing moons and Lambos and invest like a grown-up by using the tried and true strategy of dollar cost averaging. What this means is you invest a set amount, no matter the price, at a set time. If you get paid on the 1st and 15th, then you invest on the 1st and 15th, no matter what the price is. In the long run, this is far more successful than hoarding capital and trying to time the market. The next way to survive a recession is to pay off your credit card debt as fast as possible. This may be difficult, but it's critically important as interest rates are increasing. This means that what you end up owing is only going to increase every month. If you're making low payments over the long term, you might end up paying hundreds or even thousands more in interest with just a few percentage points increase. So put a taper on spending and get that credit card debt down fast. Next, you're going to want to make sure that you save money. Recessions can have a knock-on effect across a wide variety of industries, and the last thing you want is to be out of a job with no savings. It's time to tighten your belt and cut expenses to make sure that you've got a nice cushion should things go south in a hurry. If you're fortunate enough to have a significant amount of capital, then this is the time to be looking for assets that can store your wealth while not depreciating. Gold and real estate are traditionally good inflation and recession shelters, though hoarding property at the moment may be its own risk due to fears of a housing bubble collapse. With home and rent prices across the US and even the world reaching record highs, don't be surprised if social unrest and demand for government action leads to a severe drop in the value of your real estate. So perhaps read the room and park your money elsewhere. Plus, by buying real estate simply to store your money, all you're doing is making the problem worse for everyone else by lowering supply and increasing price. During a recession, stocks take a beating, but bonds are traditionally very solid investments, even during economic turmoil, though bond prices have also been hurt by the recession. If you're wondering what the difference between the two is, stocks represent partial ownership of a company. So if you buy stock in Apple, you now own a percentage of that company. Unless your percentage is sizable, don't expect to be invited to the next board meeting. Bonds, however, are loans from you to the company or government you purchased the bond from. When you buy a bond from an entity, that company or government is now in debt to you for the amount that you bought, and you'll receive interest paid on that loan for a set period of time, after which the bond will be paid back in full. Bonds are excellent investments for those looking for a set income, as every year you're guaranteed a set interest on the bond. If you buy a 10-year bond for $2,500 at an interest rate of 2%, then every year you'll get back $50 until the 10-year mark, when you'll get back the original $2,500 as well, giving you a $500 profit. Both stocks and bonds come with their own risk-reward ratio. Stocks can often yield significantly better results as your return increases as the company's own value increases. However, the opposite is also true. As the company's value decreases, so does the value of your stock. A bond, on the other hand, offers an extremely safe return on your investment, even if that return is often much smaller. The only real risk with a bond is if the entity you bought the bond from goes completely under for some reason, such as the collapse of a company or a government. During a recession, switching your investments from stocks to bonds can be a smart move and should continue to provide a small but appreciative return to help you weather the economic storm. Whatever your survival strategy, the most important part is to remember not to give in to panic. Recessions end. The sun will come out and shine again, unless you invested in Luna. Now, a cold wind cuts through the ragged tents of Hooverville. A mother huddles over a makeshift stove, stirring a pot of watery soup. She remembers the radio's advice: stretch the food, make do. She tries her best, but she knows it won't be enough. Not for her children, not for her husband. Standing miles away in a bread line, his once proud suit now caked in dust. This was America in the Great Depression, a nation brought to its knees. And all this devastation was caused by something you weren't expecting: tariffs. Or was it? Did tariffs really trigger the worst economic disaster in modern history, and could they do it again? We're breaking it all down on today's episode of The Infographic Show. Did tariffs really cause the Great Depression? You've probably heard of the Great Depression, everyone has. Stock market crash, bank failures, millions unemployed. By 1933, 1 in 4 Americans was jobless, and it wasn't just factory workers or farmers. Even doctors, lawyers, and upper-middle-class professionals saw their incomes plummet by up to 40%. Families who once lived comfortably suddenly found themselves struggling to survive. Their savings were wiped out, their futures uncertain. It was a time when make do or do without wasn't just a saying, it was a survival strategy. Families stretched every meal, patched and repaired old clothes, and walked miles instead of driving. Because with unemployment at record highs, owning and fueling a car was a luxury few could afford. The financial strain tore at the very fabric of families and communities. Divorce rates dropped, but abandonment skyrocketed. Men, ashamed and frustrated by their inability to provide for their families, often disappeared without a trace, leaving their wives and children to fend for themselves. To understand how things got so bad and what role tariffs played, we have to go back, way back, and not just to 1929 when the Great Depression began. No, we're talking about the depression that started it all, the one history barely remembers, the Forgotten Depression. The Forgotten Depression lasted just 18 months, from January 20th to July 1921, but it was brutal. The U.S. stock market tanked by 47%, and corporate profits plummeted by over 90%. Unemployment hit nearly 12%. It was just 1.4% during World War I. In the aftermath of this war, the U.S. faced a tricky transition. Factories shut down, 1.6 million soldiers returned home to flood the workforce, and inflation soared. In response, the government slashed spending by a staggering 75% and hiked interest rates to a steep 7%. The result was a 32.5% collapse in industrial production, the worst in history at the time. Prices plunged over 15%, and businesses failed en masse, leaving millions struggling to survive. The real turnaround came when President Woodrow Wilson cut federal spending by 65%, from $18.5 billion to $6.5 billion. This austerity helped stabilize the economy and eventually fueled the Roaring '20s. By March 1921, Warren Harding had taken over, and his presidency was marked by important change: the return to higher tariffs in the U.S. The U.S. has had a turbulent relationship with tariffs. One moment it's championing free trade, and the next it's slapping high tariffs to protect domestic industries. It's an economic roller coaster, swinging between protectionism and open markets, depending on the political and economic climate. Protectionism refers to government policies that restrict international trade. Think of it as putting up a fence around your country's economy to shield local businesses from foreign competition. That idea is simple. Limit imports and domestic industries have a better chance to thrive. Imports can be restricted in several ways. Tariffs are arguably the most common among them. Tariffs are essentially taxes on imported goods that make foreign products pricier, encouraging people to buy local instead. America's early days were heavily marked by protectionism. However, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the U.S. was riding high on relatively free trade, with an understanding that international commerce made large-scale wars too costly. The Underwood-Simmons Tariff of 1913 was the one to break the tradition of protectionism by lowering tariffs and introducing an income tax. This was a bold step toward free trade, but it didn't last long. World War I put nations, including the U.S., straight back into a protective mindset. By the time the U.S. emerged from the war, the political landscape had changed. European economies were recovering, and U.S. industries were facing new competition. American farmers who had been selling crops to Europe during the war were now losing those markets as European agriculture bounced back. To protect American industries and farmers from competition, the Emergency Tariff Act of 1921 was passed. But that was just the beginning. The real game-changer came in 1922. During Harding's presidency, it was the Fordney-McCumber Tariff Act. which raised tariffs above levels seen in 1913. This law wasn't just about higher rates. It also gave the president the power to adjust tariffs by as much as 50% to balance domestic and foreign production costs. The goal was simple: protect U.S. industries from foreign competition. But there was a catch. The Fordney-McCumber tariff had an unintended consequence. It crippled European exports to the U.S. With fewer American dollars flowing in, war-torn nations struggled to pay off their debts, deepening economic tensions. Instead of helping the global economy recover after World War I, the tariff made things even worse, creating friction between the U.S. and its allies, and slowing down Europe's post-war rebuilding efforts. Meanwhile, in the U.S., tariffs kept creeping up through the 1920s. These increases had a major impact on global trade, creating a skewed relationship between the U.S. and its trading partners. By the early 1930s, the world had fully embraced protectionism, and the U.S. had set the stage for the trade battles that would shape the global economy for years to come. This brings us to the very beginning of the Great Depression, a moment when the world seemed to spiral into chaos. The 1920s had been a decade of wild growth in the US. These roaring 20s were like a fever dream. Everything was booming: new cars, radios, household appliances. Americans were buying it all. And they weren't just buying goods, they were pouring money into stocks. People were in a frenzy, jumping into the market with both feet, hoping to get rich quick, and fueling a market boom that seemed unstoppable until it wasn't. Stock prices skyrocketed. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, the stock market's key index, soared nearly 162% in just 5 years. But as anyone who's been on a roller coaster knows, what goes up must come down. And this ride was about to crash hard. And the ride would start going down in October 1929. That's when the unthinkable happened. The stock market crashed. It all started on October 24th, Black Thursday. The market began its freefall, and the panic spread like wildfire. A brief rally followed, but that was a false hope. By Black Monday and Black Tuesday, the damage was irreversible. The Dow plummeted, losing nearly 90% of its value over the next few years. The American dream turned into a nightmare for so many people. But the crash wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Once the market collapsed, everything else followed. The economy froze, banks failed, businesses went bankrupt, people lost their jobs, consumers, seeing their wealth vanish, simply stopped buying. Factories and stores shut down, the whole country ground to a halt. And let's not forget the farmers. They'd already been struggling with overproduction after World War I. Crop prices were falling and they had debts they couldn't pay. It was a perfect storm, and it was only getting worse. Then came the fateful decision from the U.S. government. President Herbert Hoover, who had already enacted several major policies, decided to sign the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act into law in 1930. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was often called one of the most catastrophic acts in congressional history. And that is not just political rhetoric. That is straight from the official U.S. Senate website. When even Congress admits that they messed up, you know it was bad. But how did the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act earn such an unflattering reputation? Well, it didn't happen by accident. This was a slow-motion train wreck years in the making. It was the culmination of years of escalating protectionism, political maneuvering, and, let's be honest, a whole lot of economic short-sightedness. We've already talked about tariffs being a favorite tool of policymakers looking to shield domestic industries from foreign competition. But compared to what was coming, those earlier increases were just a warm-up act. When the Great Depression came, everyone in Washington was panicking. Desperate for a fix, lawmakers turned to an old familiar trick: tariffs. And that's how the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act came to be. The bill was originally meant to help struggling farmers by raising duties on agricultural imports. But as with most things in politics, it didn't stay simple. Lobbyists for various industries saw an opportunity and jumped in, tacking on protectionist measures for all sorts of products. By the time the bill was finalized, it wasn't just about farming anymore. It was a full-scale tariff hike on over 20,000 foreign goods. It's no surprise that roughly 1,000 economists literally begged President Hoover not to sign it. But despite his own reservations, Hoover went ahead anyway, officially signing the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act into law on the 17th of June 1930. But other countries weren't just going to sit back and take it, and that's the thing about tariffs. They often come with unintended consequences. And so Smoot-Hawley ignited what economist Chris James Michener called the mother of all trade wars. 9 countries, Argentina, Australia, Canada, Cuba, France, Italy, Mexico, Spain, and Switzerland, retaliated almost immediately with tariffs directly targeting U.S. goods. Canada's response was particularly felt. After all, the country was America's biggest trading partner at the time. In 1929, 18% of all U.S. exports went to Canada, and 11% of U.S. imports came from the country. That economic relationship was obliterated almost overnight. Initially, the Canadian Prime Minister at the time, William Lyon Mackenzie King, slapped tariffs on just 16 American products. But when R.B. Bennett took over in 1930, he cranked up the pressure. Canada raised tariffs even further on U.S. goods, while simultaneously cutting tariffs on roughly 270 products from the United Kingdom and its dominions. By 1932, Canada hosted a massive trade summit with the other British territories, laying the groundwork for a trade bloc that actively excluded the U.S. Essentially, America's protectionism pushed Canada right into Britain's arms. Canadian exports to the UK surged, especially in agriculture, the very industry Smoot-Hawley was meant to protect in the US. But this was just the start. A total of 25 countries would eventually strike back with tariffs of their own. Countries already struggling from the Great Depression suddenly faced even higher barriers to selling goods to the US, making an already bad situation worse. US exports to retaliating nations fell by 28 to 32%. Even countries that didn't retaliate still cut US exports by 15 to 23%. Global trade collapsed, dropping by 66% between 1929 and 1934. One country hit particularly hard was Germany. Already drowning in debt from World War I reparations, Germany relied on exports to earn the money needed to pay its bills. Smoot-Hawley cut off one of its key revenue streams, worsening its economic crisis. Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Samuelson described it best. Cynics were delighted at the spectacle of a country trying to collect debts from abroad and at the same time shutting out their import goods that could alone have provided the payment for those debts. In other words, America wanted its money but refused to buy anything in return. Germany's financial collapse didn't just deepen its suffering, it paved the way for Adolf Hitler's rise to power. With the economy in ruins and desperation at an all-time high, extremist voices suddenly didn't sound so extreme. As businesses crumbled and unemployment soared, Hitler's promise of economic revival and national strength became terrifyingly appealing. Less than 3 years after Smoot-Hawley was signed, Hitler was the Chancellor of Germany. But the backlash against Smoot-Hawley wasn't just economic, it was also political. 35 governments lodged formal protests against it, and nations even formed new trade alliances to deliberately exclude the US. This fit right into the broader trend of American isolationism in the 1930s. But this kind of economic nationalism wasn't new. The phrase "America First" was already commonly used at the time to describe protectionist policies. Despite President Woodrow Wilson winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 1919 for creating the League of Nations, a forerunner of the United Nations, the US never even joined it. Smoot-Hawley only reinforced this isolationist stance, making America seem less cooperative and more self-serving. But all this doesn't answer the main question: did tariffs really cause the Great Depression? It's easy to assume that the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 only made the Great Depression worse, especially since the crisis officially began in 1929. But the reality is more complicated, which is why the true impact of tariffs on the Great Depression remains a topic of debate even today. Economists hold different views of the matter. Some argue that Smoot-Hawley was the spark that ignited the Great Depression, turning a recession into a global catastrophe. But what about the timeline? If the stock market had already crashed, was the tariff really to blame? Or was it just pouring gasoline on an already burning fire? Well, before the tariff was signed into law in June 1930, the economy was struggling. There's no doubt about it. However, there was still hope for a recovery. But then Smoot-Hawley slammed the brakes on global trade, cutting off U.S. businesses from foreign markets just when they needed them the most. The ensuing trade war slashed U.S. exports from $5.2 billion to just $1.7 billion, a massive 67% drop. And the hardest hit sector was agriculture, the sector Smoot-Hawley was trying to protect before all the lobbyists got involved. Crops like wheat, cotton, and tobacco, which relied on international demand, were hammered, pushing farmers into bankruptcy and causing small banks, especially in rural areas, to collapse. But that's not even the most shocking claim about tariffs causing the Great Depression. One economist, Jude Wanniski, claimed that the stock market crash of 1929 was actually triggered by tariffs. Well, the anticipation of tariffs, that is. According to Wanniski, the market started anticipating the act as early as December 1928. That's almost 8 months before Hoover even signed the bill into law. It's as if Wall Street could sense the impending protectionist storm, and it panicked. This view suggests that the mere fear of looming tariffs was enough to spook investors. This triggered a chain reaction that ultimately led to the stock market collapse and the official start of the Great Depression. But let's turn the lens to the other side. Some economists argue that the Depression was already underway by the time the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act took effect. This would mean that the tariffs didn't cause it. By 1930, when the bill was passed, unemployment was already climbing, The stock market had already shown signs of instability, and the economy was already heading south. The proponents of the theory point to the fact that the exports only accounted for about 7% of the US GDP in 1929. So how big of an impact could the tariffs really have had? Remember, the US had raised tariffs in 1922 too, and it didn't trigger the Great Depression then. In fact, some argue that the Depression caused the decline in trade, not the other way around. Many experts agree that Smoot-Hawley didn't directly cause the Depression. It just made an already bad situation worse. You can think of it like this. The Depression was already a storm cloud hanging over the economy. Smoot-Hawley was the lightning strike that turned it into a full-blown thunderstorm. So it didn't create the storm, but it definitely made it worse. It caused a whole vicious cycle of retaliation, where one country raised tariffs and others strike back. As a result, trade shrinks, and the recession deepens. Smoot-Hawley was a disaster. It's as simple as that. Even if it didn't single-handedly trigger the Great Depression, it definitely made things worse. The sharp decline in global trade, the collapse of agricultural exports, and the retaliation from other countries all point to one undeniable fact. Protectionism simply doesn't work. It's like trying to save a sinking boat by patching one hole while drilling another. So whether the tariffs were the final straw, the main cause, or just a bad idea that added fuel to the fire, one thing is for sure, Smoot-Hawley should have never happened. President Franklin Roosevelt realized this almost immediately. That's why he set about fixing the damage, working to undo Smoot-Hawley's catastrophic effects as soon as he took office in 1933. And his response to the tariff disaster was bold and swift. The New Deal, Roosevelt's game-changing blueprint for America's recovery, wasn't just about saving the banks and putting people back to work. It was about shaking things up and tackling the issues that the Smoot-Hawley tariffs had messed up in the first place. And one of Roosevelt's biggest moves was cutting down those sky-high tariffs that had caused an international economic food fight. Remember, the Smoot-Hawley tariff strangled global trade and dragged the economy even deeper into the mess. So Roosevelt's plan was to do the exact opposite. One of his boldest moves during these efforts was the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934. This wasn't just a tweak to the system, it was like hitting the undo button on the disastrous protectionist policies that had been put in place. Roosevelt had the authority to negotiate directly with foreign governments, cutting tariffs on both sides of the Atlantic. His goal was to break the cycle of retaliation and get trade flowing again. After all, a world that is trading is a world that is thriving. Roosevelt's act set the stage for the U.S. to pivot from isolationist policies to becoming the global champion of free trade. So in the years that followed, the U.S. took the lead in establishing major international trade agreements, including the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, which later evolved into the World Trade Organization, or WTO. By tearing down tariffs and opening the doors for international cooperation, President Roosevelt showed that protectionism wasn't the way out, it was the way to stay stuck in a never-ending economic slump. But while Roosevelt's efforts were crucial, the real end to the Great Depression came with an unexpected twist: World War II. When the U.S. entered the war in 1941, something dramatic happened. Unemployment plummeted from a staggering 8 million in 1940 to just over 1 million by 1943. But in reality, more than 16 million Americans were conscripted into the armed forces. So real private sector unemployment actually stayed a lot higher than those numbers suggest. After World War II, international trade channels opened up and reversed those crushing price and wage controls. Suddenly, there was a massive demand for cheap goods. The government, as a huge buyer, gave the economy the much-needed fiscal stimulus it had been missing. This jump-started industries, created jobs, and paved the way for private investment to surge. In fact, private investment shot up from $10.6 billion in 1940 to $30.6 billion just 1 year after the war wrapped up. By the end of the war, the economy wasn't just back on track, it was booming. The stock market went on a bull run, and things started looking up for the American public. And that's what ended the Great Depression. The economic shift triggered by wartime demand, investment, and global trading channels. However, just because the U.S. managed to come out of the Great Depression doesn't mean the road was a smooth one. Quite the contrary, it was rocky, treacherous, and full of lessons that, frankly, we would rather not repeat. The damage done by the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was catastrophic, and the scars from that period are still a part of economic history. So let's be clear, no one, and we mean no one, would want to go down that road again, right? Well, it turns out history isn't as far behind us as we might have hoped. Just when we thought that we learned the painful lessons of the past, tariffs are making a dramatic comeback. The U.S. administration's rhetoric about tariffs today even has a certain nostalgia to it. The latest approach to tariffs isn't just about protecting U.S. industries from foreign competition. It's about using tariffs like a weapon of power, aiming them at Canada, Mexico, China, and even Europe. all while claiming that these measures will improve the U.S. standing on the world stage. Tariffs are being used to force political concessions like immigration control or geopolitical leverage. But history has shown that tariffs are a risky game, and that is putting it mildly, especially today. Unlike the pre-World War II era, the global economy today is far more interconnected. Complex supply chains, particularly between the US, Canada, and Mexico, mean that even small disruptions can cause major ripple effects. And that is where things get complicated. This isn't just about damaging one sector or one country, it's about jeopardizing entire economic ecosystems. When one domino falls, the ripple effects can be felt worldwide. America's tariffs, especially the ones imposed on China, could lead to real economic downturn. Experts warn that these moves could raise household costs, shrink U.S. economic output, and even trigger a broader trade war that could make the global recession of the 1930s look like a mild inconvenience. And while it's too soon to say whether these tariffs will push us into a Great Depression 2.0, the potential for a repeat of history is undeniably there, especially if retaliation from other countries turns into a full-blown tit-for-tat. The America First approach might seem appealing in the short term, but if even a sliver of the chaos from the 1930s comes back, we could be facing a far grimmer reality. We can only hope that we've learned from those past mistakes. Do you think the Smoot-Hawley tariff helped trigger the Great Depression, or was it just one piece of a much bigger puzzle? Could we be headed for a Great Depression 2.0, or do you think other factors would have to line up before we reach that level of crisis? America pumps out over 12 million barrels of oil per day, earning its spot as the largest producer on the planet. So despite being the top producer, America is also the second largest importer of oil. We'll explain exactly why on today's episode of the Infographics Show. The U.S. can't use all its oil. Oil is the world's lifeblood, and the United States is top dog when it comes to production. On average, the U.S. produces around 13 billion barrels of crude oil per day, with some record-breaking days in late 2024 reaching 13.5 million barrels. That adds up to a staggering 4.7 billion barrels per year, enough to fill a Super Bowl-sized stadium nearly every 2 days. Yet America consumes far more than it produces, around 20.4 million barrels of oil per day, or 7.4 billion barrels per year. It might seem ridiculous then that the U.S. doesn't use all of its own oil, but instead exports roughly half of the oil it pumps to other countries. The answer, as usual, traces back to decisions made decades ago, ones that left future generations to deal with the consequences. To understand why, we have to understand the oil life cycle itself first. You can't just take oil from the ground and stick it in your car. Well, technically you can, but it's not going to do much but make your local mechanic very wealthy. Oil needs refining before it becomes anything useful. That means investing in refineries to process raw petroleum into gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and other essential products. The first step in refining oil is heating it and sending it into a massive distillation column where it naturally separates based on weight. Lighter components like gasoline rise to the top, while heavier fuels like diesel sink to the bottom. This process produces a variety of essential products. Gases like propane and butane are used for heating and cooking, naphtha for gasoline and plastics, kerosene, which is refined into jet fuel, diesel and gas oil for trucks and heavy machinery. The residue at the bottom was once dumped into waterways, but now it's used as ship fuel and road asphalt. The problem is that oil naturally contains heavier products that aren't as useful as gasoline. To fix this, refineries use a process called cracking to break down large molecules into smaller, more valuable ones. Additionally, low-quality gasoline can be reformed by rearranging its molecular structure and boosting octane levels, making it more efficient at powering engines. At some point in the past, people decided that maybe it wasn't a good idea to let oil companies literally smog the entire country with lead and other incredibly harmful chemicals. This meant treating processes were improved and additives like lead were banned. The treating process helped to remove impurities from the fuel that improves the quality of the fuel, but also makes it slightly less catastrophic than it already is for the environment. This process removes sulfur, nitrogen, and heavy metals from oil, making modern gasoline much cleaner than past fuels. Processed fuels are blended to improve performance, stability, or in the case of jet fuel, to ensure it only burns under precise conditions, making it safer for aviation. Oil refining is a complex, costly process, and refineries are incredibly expensive to build, operate, and maintain. And it's not just about money, it's about time. When a refinery is built today, the expectation is it won't start refining fuel for nearly a decade. The problem with American refineries is that most of them are the wrong type. Decades ago, oil companies focused their investments on building refineries along the Gulf Coast, designed specifically to process heavy crude from Venezuela, Canada, and the Middle East. These regions could pump oil all day long, but the real challenge wasn't extraction, it was refining. Globally, the world produces more oil than it can refine, creating a massive backlog in the industry. That oil has to be transported to refineries, which need to occasionally shut down for complicated maintenance. Overall, refining capacity is barely keeping up with oil production, though a major expansion is expected over the next 4 years. Refining is an incredibly complex and expensive process, and historically only wealthy nations could afford the massive investments needed to build and maintain these facilities. With this in mind, American oil companies decided to construct refineries designed for the specific types of crude oil being imported from overseas, rather than refining lighter domestic oil. And this means modern Americans are stuck with the wrong equipment. Oil comes in different types depending on its origin. The US primarily produces sweet crude, but decades ago corporations built infrastructure to refine sour crude instead. Sour crude is the workhorse of oil types. With a sulfur content above 0.5%, it's harder and more expensive to refine into lighter fuels. This low-grade oil is mostly used for heavy machinery and is primarily produced in Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Alberta, the Gulf of America, formerly the Gulf of Mexico, and the Middle East. At first, building U.S. refining capacity for this heavy crude made sense. But when domestic oil production surged, the U.S. realized it had a refinery problem. The U.S. does have some sour crude deposits, but it also sits on massive reserves of sweet crude oil. While sour crude is the workhorse of oils, sweet crude, with its 0.42% or lower sulfur content, is the premium grade. It is high quality, efficient, and high in demand. Refineries prefer sweet crude because it's easier to process and it yields more high-value petroleum products like gasoline, heating oil, and jet fuel. But America is incapable of refining all the superior oil that it produces every year. Instead, it has to export the sweet crude to other countries. And there is still the problem of a crazy 100-year-old law to contend with. But first, why not just modify refineries and make America completely self-sufficient? Well, it's not as simple as just switching infrastructure over, because it would require a massive redesign of refineries. The refineries have to keep running in order to continue feeding the global oil supply and not cause any interruptions. Shutting down these refineries for extensive modifications would have a direct impact on not just the American economy but the world. You can't stop the global oil trade or even slow it down without bad things happening. Economies start to shrink the moment oil availability is affected. The 1973 OPEC oil embargo only lasted 5 months, and despite the U.S. being a major oil producer, it absolutely wrecked the U.S. economy. Inflation skyrocketed from 3.4% at the start of the embargo to 12.3% at the start of 1974. The economic fallout led to unemployment shooting up to 9% in 1975 from 4.6%. The U.S. immediately entered a multi-year recession and the Dow Jones dropped a whopping 45%. This is why the U.S. has made it a priority to ensure the continued free flow of oil worldwide. And while many memes joke about the U.S. invading Iraq for oil, the reality is that America was more concerned with keeping global oil markets stable rather than securing the oil for itself. A disruption in oil supply doesn't just affect one country, it triggers economic crashes, and history has shown that economic instability often leads to war. Shutting down U.S. oil refineries in order to modify them wouldn't be as bad as an outright embargo, but it would slow down the global oil trade enough to be a problem. So for the foreseeable future, we are stuck with a bad bet made decades ago. But why not just build refineries that can handle the right type of oil? Unfortunately, that's not an economically feasible option right now. Building new refineries is extremely expensive, and investors need to be in it for the long haul. For example, the Dangote refinery in Nigeria, which can process 650,000 barrels per day, costs $20 billion to build. Meanwhile, an expansion to Aramco's Motiva factory in Texas required a $30 billion investment. If the upfront cost wasn't already daunting, there's another issue. Investors simply aren't interested. Profit margins in refining aren't high enough to attract non-state investors, making new refineries a hard sell. On top of that, the rise of green energy is further discouraging investment. As electric and hydrogen vehicles become more widespread and renewable energy sources like solar, wind, and tidal power continue to expand, global demand for oil and gas is steadily decreasing. Remember that crazy law we kept bringing up? Well, a 105-year-old law is basically making it impossible for Americans to use their own oil. When World War I broke out, the United States realized it had one glaring strategic weakness. Despite being a maritime nation, the U.S. relied heavily on foreign shipping. In 1920, Senator Wesley Jones introduced the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. aimed at ensuring that America would always have a strong merchant marine fleet ready to call on in case of emergency. More than that, though, it was a way of protecting the U.S. shipping industry from being undercut by foreign shippers, who could pay their crews lower wages and enact lower costs, often by cutting safety corners. What came to be known as the Jones Act required that any ship transporting goods between American ports must be built in the U.S. The U.S. Navy has historically viewed this as a major advantage, as the Jones Act ensures that American shipyards are always employed and the nation's shipbuilding industry remains healthy. The problem is, the Jones Act is sorta making it impossible for America to use its own oil. It's actually cheaper for American refineries on the East Coast to import oil from the other side of the planet than from the Gulf of America. It all comes down to shipping prices. U.S. ships typically cost 4 to 5 times more than their foreign-made counterparts. This is largely due to higher wages for American shipbuilders and strict regulations on ship construction. While a U.S.-made ship is among the toughest in the world, practically unsinkable, that level of durability comes at a steep price. Great for quality, terrible for capitalism. Making matters worse, American merchant marines often earn significantly more than their foreign counterparts. Add in regulations for safety and environmental protection, and the cost of shipping oil between U.S. ports skyrockets, anywhere between 2 to 5 times higher than international shipping rates. And while it can cost up to $6 a barrel to ship Texas oil to an East Coast refinery, importing oil from overseas costs just $2 a barrel. So instead of using its own oil, America ends up shipping a lot of it to foreign refineries in the most convoluted trade exchange of a major commodity of human history. And then there's an industrial revolution that left American oil refineries in the dust. How can too much be a good thing? Well, when it comes to American oil production, producing too much oil can actually be so problematic that the U.S. can't even use all the oil it pumps. In the 2010s, oil production boomed thanks to a revolution in production. Called the Shale Revolution, new technology and economic pressures led to the development of hydraulic fracking techniques. Normally, oil producers all over the world had been limited to the oil that could be pumped from deep underground reservoirs. However, a lot of oil is actually trapped outside of the reservoirs in what's known as shale rock. These rock deposits lie between 5 and 10,000 feet beneath the surface of the earth. While it was easy to get to them, the process of extracting the oil had to wait until the development of horizontal drilling techniques. Here's how it works. A well is drilled vertically until it reaches the shale rock layer, where oil and gas have been trapped for millions of years. Once there, the drill bit turns 90 degrees, running horizontally for about 2 miles to access more of the resource-rich rock. To reinforce the well, steel casings are inserted and cement is poured, a barrier meant to protect local groundwater from what comes next. But the efficacy of that is under serious dispute. To release the oil, a fracking solution is inserted. It's made up of 90% water, around 9.5% sand, and 0.5% chemicals. Its job is to basically fracture the shale rock layer and release the trapped oil and gas. Inserted at pressures of over 15,000 pounds per square inch, the rock layer begins fracturing and the oil and gas flows into the well where it can be extracted. There is significant controversy around fracking, as large amounts of the fracking water will return to the surface due to flowback. What's definitely true is that fracking turned the U.S. into an energy superpower practically overnight. Oil and gas production skyrocketed in the 2010s and completely rewrote U.S. energy policy. But the problem is, we weren't ready for the production boom. Oil corporations couldn't predict where American oil production would expand to. Thus, the nation's oil infrastructure is primarily built along predictable production and refining areas. That's a problem when suddenly your biggest oil-producing regions are Texas's Permian Basin, North Dakota's Bakken Formation, and New Mexico, but your largest refineries are in Louisiana, California, and Illinois. The shale revolution triggered a massive boom in oil production, but ironically, it became cheaper to export that oil overseas rather than use it domestically. Getting it to American refineries would have required building extensive new infrastructure, including pipelines, storage tanks, and entirely new rail and shipping routes. Oil is a global commodity, meaning it operates within a global marketplace. The same economic factors that make it cheaper for the U.S. to import oil for refining also make it cheaper for other countries to import American oil, even when closer suppliers are available. Take China, for example. Despite having very few natural oil deposits, it relies heavily on imports to fuel its economy, while remaining a major global refiner of petroleum products. That's because when China crunched the numbers, they realized that global market dynamics made it cheaper to build refineries and import crude from the US rather than buying a finished product from closer suppliers like the Middle East. Despite being geographically closer to major oil-producing nations, China found that importing U.S. crude and refining it domestically was the most cost-effective option, with India following a similar strategy, becoming a major importer of American oil. This has created a convoluted, highly complex web of global oil trade, where some nations import oil from the other side of the planet rather than using their own domestic production. Meanwhile, others import more oil than they need, not for consumption but to refine and sell at a profit. Both India and China have been taking full advantage of cheap Russian oil, refining it into higher value fuels and petrochemical products to resell on the global market at a premium. Russia, on the other hand, has been stuck exporting raw crude, the least lucrative part of the petroleum chain. Russia has historically relied on Western technology and expertise for refining. But thanks to sanctions and boycotts, they're now forced to sell crude at a discount while other nations reap the real profits. America's unusual oil production, refining, and import system might seem illogical, but it's not changing anytime soon. While this keeps U.S. prices lower than they might otherwise be, there's a strong case for investing in domestic infrastructure now. If the U.S. were to modernize its refining capacity and transport network, gasoline could become much cheaper at the pump, while also making the nation far more secure against global supply disruptions. Should the U.S. invest in fixing its oil infrastructure to lower prices and boost energy security, or is the current system just how the global markets work? A lot has happened in the last few years, from a global pandemic to Russia invading Ukraine. Both of these events had a huge economic impact on economies around the world and might even be leading to recessions in many. But what if things get worse? When does a recession become a depression? And should you be worried? Let's find out. These are unprecedented times as modern-day economies have never had to contend with a global pandemic, a war, and supply chain issues all at the same time. The decisions made during this period in human history and the impact they'll have on the future are unknown. However, we do know that due to current events, economies have slowed and inflation is on the rise. These factors, along with increasing unemployment rates, bankruptcies, and falling consumer spending, are key indicators that an economy could be heading toward a recession. But what does that actually mean? And are recessions such a bad thing? We'll dig into that, but first there's one thing we know without a doubt is bad. Something small that you probably do each and every morning. What's the first thing you do when you wake up? Do you grab your phone, open a news or social media app, and start scrolling, and when you finally found something that looks interesting, the actual story turns out to be dry, dense, and boring? It's the worst possible way to start your day. But don't worry, there's now a better way to wake up with Morning Brew. Morning Brew is a free daily newsletter that'll get you up to speed on topics that matter most to you in just 5 minutes. Their business, finance, and tech stories are witty, relevant, but most importantly informative, so you can start your day off with a concentrated blast of the news you actually want to hear. Like a 3-minute read on the real state of real estate, or a breakdown of Meta's new AI text-to-video generator. They even have a mini crossword puzzle to start activating your brain in the right way. But to get it, you'll have to sign up for Morning Brew yourself. It's completely free and takes less than 15 seconds, so start getting smarter in just 5 minutes every day by signing up for Morning Brew at morningbrewdaily.com/infographics or click the link in the description. A recession is defined as a slowdown or shrinking of an economy over the course of several months. Many experts classify a recession as 2 consecutive quarters of declines in real gross domestic product or GDP. Real GDP means that economic numbers have been adjusted to account for inflation so that they can be more accurately compared to other quarters of economic activity. This creates a more precise picture of what the economy is actually doing and if we might be heading for a financial disaster. However, it's important to keep in mind that recessions are a normal part of economic growth. If you've ever bought stocks or followed the stock market, you know that there are inevitable highs and lows over the course of several years. Almost all economists agree that recessions are a part of the long cycle that economies go through in order to grow organically. Economies will continue to grow until something triggers them to slow down or shrink. There are plenty of reasons why this might happen, such as war, pandemics, or the bursting of a financial bubble like in the 2007 housing market in the United States. Another key factor that can indicate whether or not an economy is headed toward a recession is rising interest rates. It might seem intuitive that if high interest rates cause an economy to slow down, banks and governments should just keep interest rates as low as possible. But it's not that simple. Recently, interest rates have been on the rise, and for good reason. Increasing interest rates are a good way to slow down or reverse inflation. Inflation is when prices increase and result in a currency losing value as consumers must spend more money than they used to in order to purchase some products. However you think about it, inflation is bad for the consumer and for the economy. This has been happening as we come out of the pandemic. People who kept their jobs or qualified for stimulus checks had money they could spend at the time as they couldn't go out and do things. When COVID restrictions became more relaxed, people spent that saved up money, creating a high demand for products. Unfortunately, the amount of products being produced was disrupted by factories shutting down and supply chain issues caused by the pandemic. This has led to prices for everyday goods such as groceries and electronics to skyrocket. The supply for these goods cannot keep up with the demand, and prices are rising too fast for the consumer to keep up with. Inflation of prices has caused the Federal Reserve in the United States to increase interest rates so that people will be less likely to take out loans to rack up debt. At the time that this video was made, increased interest rates seem to have worked and inflation levels appear to be stabilizing. However, only time will tell if higher interest rates have actually stopped the United States from going into a recession. Many countries worldwide are battling this same problem and have taken precautionary measures to ensure their economies don't go into a recession. But what happens in a worst-case scenario? What if the United States or other countries do go into a recession? The main concern for most people during a recession is that unemployment rates go up. As the economy slows down, companies need to lay off employees to cut costs. This means more and more people have less income to spend, which will slow down the economy even more. When people are laid off because of a recession, more pressure is put on the government to provide aid. Yet the government is also hurting financially during these times, making it difficult to lend support to the citizens. Once an economy is in a recession, things start to spiral downward. However, raising interest rates, providing support to the unemployed, and giving businesses time to recover will cause the economy to pick back up and grow again. This will bring jobs back and allow businesses to become profitable as people begin spending their money again. But what if this doesn't happen? What if the economy spirals out of control? This is when a depression occurs. Currently, there's only been one economic depression in the United States, the Great Depression, which lasted from 1929 to 1939. However, since these are unprecedented times, there is no knowing what the economic future will hold. So what exactly is a depression, and how does it differ from recessions? Many economists agree that a depression is just a really long recession. There's no exact length of time that an economy needs to be in decline for a depression to be declared, but it typically needs to be several years. Recessions tend to last 2 or more quarters of a fiscal year, or about 6 months, but can be longer if things get really bad. During the 1973 oil crisis, when oil prices quadrupled and the stock market crashed, the U.S. economy was in a recession for about a year and 4 months. Similarly, the Great Recession of 2008 lasted around a year and a half. However, none of these periods of time are classified as depressions because they did not meet certain other criteria. A recession transitions to a depression when it lasts roughly 2 or more years. The real GDP of an economy also needs to decline by at least 10% in a single year for that time period to be considered an economic depression. Like with a recession, a key indicator that an economy is in a depression other than the dramatic lowering of GDP is high unemployment rates. However, unlike a recession, these unemployment rates continue to grow for years until the economy finally bottoms out. A byproduct of depression is that international trade tends to stall and production is dialed back as consumers both at home and abroad lose faith in the economy. The easiest way to understand an economic depression is to examine the only one that has ever happened. Like recessions of past and present, the Great Depression occurred due to a number of different factors. The first was that the U.S. economy grew tremendously and unsustainably during the Roaring '20s. It seemed as if the profits would never stop, which led to the masses pouring huge amounts of money into the stock market. They would take out loans from banks just so they could invest more money with their stipulation that they would pay interest on the loans using the gains from when they sold their stocks. This worked great for most of the 20s, but then everything fell apart. Banks lent out too much money that they didn't have with the expectation that it'd all come back with interest. It's important to remember that whatever goes up must come down, even the economy. People mortgaged their homes and used all of their disposable income to buy into the stock market. In October of 1929, the stock market reached its peak and then began to cool off. This was always bound to happen as economic growth can't last forever. There's always an inevitable resettling of the stock market so that it can grow organically in the future. Unfortunately, during the 1920s, people were not thinking about the consequences of pouring all of their money and assets into an economic system that would eventually need to reset. Stock markets began to decline, and everyone began to panic. If the masses remained calm and didn't try to desperately pull out all their money, the crash of 1929 might have just led to a recession, but that's not what happened. Banks and companies warned that if everyone withdrew all their money at once, they would default on their loans, and the entire economy would fall apart. But no one listened. This would be one of the main factors that led to the Great Depression. At the same time that the stock market crashed, people lost faith in the banks themselves. They had seen the bad decisions made by the bankers when they extended loans that were not sustainable. Now people were worried that the banks would lose all their savings as well, so they started withdrawing all of their money from financial institutions. With less money in their vaults, banks defaulted on more loans, thus exacerbating the economic decline even further and extending the depression of the economy for several more years. During the Great Depression, the unemployment rate skyrocketed to almost 25%. A quarter of the country couldn't feed their families, let alone buy products or invest in the economy. This meant businesses couldn't grow and entire industries collapsed. It's estimated that the GDP fell by 30%, as United States companies struggled to produce their products and sell them within the country and abroad. And this led to another problem. As the United States economy went into free fall, it had consequences for the rest of the world. U.S. citizens struggled to make ends meet, meaning they didn't have surplus money to spend on foreign products. This hurt other economies around the world that depended heavily on the U.S. consumer buying their goods. The exports coming out of the United States tended to be relatively cheap, while products from countries in Europe were more expensive. As foreign economies bought more and more U.S. goods, their gold stores flowed into the United States. This in turn devalued the currencies of other countries as their gold reserves were depleted. Foreign banks raised interest rates to try to stop the trade imbalance, but it was too late. The Great Depression in the United States spread across the world and caused other economies to decline. In the end, the United States was not the only country to experience a depression during the 30s. Almost every economy in the world was impacted by a decline in output and trade. In order to fix the economy, United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt started the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC. This organization used several monetary and fiscal policies to stabilize the economy and increase GDP. These policies, along with high interest rates, eventually caused the economy to recover. It's important to note that the Great Depression was a series of unfortunate events that all occurred at the same time. This is exactly how recessions occur as well. There is rarely a single event that economists can point to which causes the recession. This is why economists, bankers, and corporations don't know if an economy is in a recession until it actually happens. Predicting a recession with 100% accuracy is impossible. There are definitely key factors that indicate a recession might be coming, such as an increase in inflation and the resulting increase in interest rates. And if unemployment rates are going up at the same time as interest rates, there's an even higher chance that an economy is about to go into a recession. However, until real GDP can be analyzed and economists have all of the data, no definitive conclusion can be made. So, the difference between an economic recession and depression is mostly a matter of time and how bad things really get. A severe recession that lasts for several years is definitely a depression. Also, if GDP declines by 10% multiple years in a row, then an economy is also officially in a depression. And since we now operate in a global economy, one country's recession will impact the rest of the world's economies. This is especially true of countries like the United States, China, and those in the European Union, who generate an enormous amount of GDP and are also large consumers. Only time will tell how current events will affect the economy, but one thing is for sure. If a major economy goes into a depression in today's day and age, it'll have severe consequences for economies around the world. People are screaming into telephones. Papers are flying everywhere. You look around the New York Stock Exchange as chaos ensues. Two people run directly into each other, sending the memos and sales orders they're carrying into the air. The important documents float down to the ground like delicate snowflakes, only to be trampled a moment later by businessmen running for the door. "All is lost," someone yells. "This is the end," a banker shouts from the mob trying to escape the mayhem. Black Thursday is upon you. The Great Depression is in full force. The closing bell rings. Stock trading comes to an end on Thursday, October 24th, 1929. Sweat pours down your face as you wipe your brow with the back of your arm. Your fingers are torn, blood trickles from the hundreds of paper cuts you received while making deals and exchanging documents. 12.9 million shares were traded throughout the day, and your sales only made up a minuscule portion of it. You tried to buy low and sell high, but the high never came. Prices of stocks just kept plummeting. You stuff your documents into your briefcase and exit out onto Wall Street. You need a stiff drink. Unfortunately, it's the time of prohibition and alcohol is illegal. Time to go to a speakeasy. You walk into a barbershop. "Hey Bill," you say to the man cutting your hair. You give him a polite nod. He frowns at you and your overstuffed briefcase. Bill knew what was coming from the stories the Wall Street guys told him during the haircuts. He made a wise choice and sold his stocks a few weeks prior to the crash. Bill didn't get the best return on his investment, but at least his money was out of the stock market. You walk past the row of barber chairs and enter the phone booth at the back of the shop. You dial 1933 and wait. There's the sound of a bolt unlatching, and the back of the phone booth opens up to a dark, smoke-filled room. Businessmen sit at the tables in the hidden speakeasy, smoking cigars and drinking bootleg liquor. Everyone needs a drink after the stock market crash today. Unfortunately, things were only going to get worse. You sit at an empty table alongside the hardwood wall. As your body relaxes into the chair, you let out a heavy sigh. You signal one of the servers that you're ready for a drink. As you wait, one of the gangsters that owns the establishment makes his way over to you. He saunters up to the table with a big smile on his face. Business is good for the crime bosses during this time. They're making huge amounts of money off of bootlegging alcohol. They've also been loaning out money to those in need of it. The gangster stands over you, the smile never leaving his face. "I heard it wasn't a great day at the stock market," he says. "Don't forget, payment on your loan is still due at the end of the month, with interest." The gangster places his hand heavily on your shoulder, showing he means what he says, and there will be consequences if you don't comply. Like so many others during this time, you're in a desperate need of money to dig yourself out of a financial hole. Seeing themselves as good businessmen, the crime bosses use your desperation as an opportunity. They increase their enterprises in loan sharking and labor racketeering, basically what the banks were doing but under a different name. And when the banks did it, it was illegal. Since half the banks are closed in the US, you need somewhere else to get a loan. Gangsters have been picking up the slack. They're happy to loan you money with unbelievable amounts of interest, of course. After your unpleasant conversation with a gangster, your drink arrives. You spot one of your fellow bankers entering the speakeasy. You signal him to come sit. He plops down in the chair across from you. "What happened today?" you ask. "Black Thursday," the banker responds. He reaches out and snags a shot of grain alcohol from the tray of a server walking by. He downs it in one gulp. "That stuff will make you go blind," he warned. He looks at you, reaches down, grabs your drink, and knocks it back. "Worse things could happen," he says. And worse things did happen. The Great Depression touched every life in the United States and caused people all over the world to suffer. It was a time of unsure futures and loss. What happened? What caused the stock markets to crash and the American way of life to crumble? How did 15 million Americans lose their jobs and nearly half of the country's banks fail? Like many economic disasters, there were several different reasons. The decade before the Great Depression was given the name the Roaring Twenties. Things were good in the US. World War I was over and the economy received a nice boost from wartime production. US businesses expanded rapidly and the country's wealth more than doubled during this time. Business was good and everyone wanted a piece of the action. Citizens invested in the stock market. Whether you were a railroad tycoon or just someone working on the railroad, you put your money into the stock market. Money poured into the New York Stock Exchange. Everything was great until it wasn't. The agricultural sector had fallen behind and began to collapse during the 1920s. The average businessman and factory worker had no idea that farmers were struggling to keep their land and maintain crop production. But the failings of the agricultural sector started to lead to higher prices for food. Even with these high prices, the farmers couldn't keep up. They started to panic, but the government didn't want to hear it while the economy was doing so well. Maybe they should have listened to the farmers a little more closely. Politicians were not the only ones living on cloud nine. Banks were giving out loans like money grew on trees. The government wasn't regulating them, so they were free to give and take money as they pleased. Bad investments were made, but who cared? There was always another opportunity right around the corner. Unfortunately, working wages had not kept up with the huge profits the banks and corporations were making. People started to borrow and borrow and borrow. They would spend the money banks gave so generously out, but had no way to repay the loans and the hefty interest that went along with it. Money kept pouring into the stock market, but it was money that the buyers didn't really have. Stock prices were inflated and in excess of their real value. Then it happened. Investors and consumers got a glimpse of what was on the horizon and lost confidence in the stock market. Everyone wanted out all at once. That is when Black Thursday and the subsequent crash of the New York Stock Exchange led to the years known as the Great Depression. The United States was not the only country affected by the stock market collapse. International trade was still recovering from World War I. Many European countries relied heavily on American sales and investments for income. They also owed the United States huge sums of money in loans that had been given to help Europe rebuild after much of the continent and the people living there were ravaged by the war. The United States needed money. Europe didn't have any to give, and the money the world was making off the lucrative United States stock market went to ashes overnight. The world economy was on the brink of collapse. But what about you? What about the average citizen? What was life like for someone who had invested heavily in the stock market and lost everything? It was not pleasant, to say the least. You return home after another long day of looking for a job. You are covered in dust and sweat from walking since sunrise. You've gone to every open factory, but no one needs more help. Business is not booming, and they already are at capacity for workers. This is the story that the average American citizen was told when looking for work. Even manual labor jobs are hard to come by, and when you do find one, they pay pennies. The government had been creating public works jobs and employing thousands of people, but even the government doesn't have enough money to pay their workers, and layoffs ensue. When you aren't looking for jobs, you're standing in line for soup kitchens. Everyone is hungry. Relief organizations cannot secure enough food because of the failing agricultural industry. The lines for soup kitchens span city blocks. Even if you wait in them an entire day, there's no guarantee they'll have any food left when you reach the front of the line. Massive marches are organized to force greedy bankers and the government to provide more public services. Protesters set up camp outside the government buildings because they have nowhere else to go. Everyone needs support, and those who still have money are not willing to let it go to help the common person. Unfortunately, poverty and hunger are not the only things to plague American citizens during the Great Depression. Disease, such as tuberculosis, goes unchecked. The healthcare infrastructure in the United States is underfunded, and there are not enough trained doctors and nurses. If you get sick, you either live with your illness or you die. There is little or no hope of getting help. The winters are cold and harsh, causing vast numbers of homeless and sick people to freeze during these months. Life expectancy and birth rates drop because there just aren't enough resources to support the elderly or newborns. It's a time of tragedy in the family life of United States citizens. You and your family begin to pass the time by going to weekly shows. Every Sunday, Shirley Temple plays on the big screen. If the show is not free, you can always just sneak in. The community tries their best to support one another, and if someone falls ill, others try to help in any way they can. This could be something as simple as giving pieces of coal to warm up an apartment or handing over a few cents that might be spared if they're lucky enough to have a job. Life is hard during the Great Depression, but people will band together to try to get through it. Without the support of the community, no one will make it. Not all populations were affected in the same way. Although there were some wage policies put in place for white working men, black men were not afforded the same treatment. Farm and manual labor jobs that black men worked at had no minimum wages. Therefore, when times got hard, business owners could drop the wages to unlivable levels. But people had to work even if it was for next to nothing. Black communities were not given the same relief packages from the government as white communities due to discrimination practices with local governments. Despite all of this tragedy, there was a beacon of light on the horizon for black citizens. Under the Roosevelt administration, there was what came to be known as the Black Cabinet, led by Mary McLeod Bethune. Bethune was a champion for racial and gender equality. As Roosevelt's Director of Negro Affairs of the National Youth Administration, she ensured that every New Deal agency had a black advisor on it. The number of African Americans working in government tripled under her leadership. Civil rights still had a long way to go, but it was through Bethune's passion for equality and hard work that strides were made during the Great Depression to make the country more equitable for everyone. There was one group of Americans who actually gained more jobs during the Great Depression. The number of employed women rose by 24%. The marriage rates during the Great Depression decreased by 22%. Nobody could afford to date or start a family without money or a job, and this in turn led to large amounts of single women looking for employment to support themselves and their families. Jobs available to women such as nursing, teaching, and domestic work were still in demand. The messed up part of the system, though, was that the government's wage code set lower wages for women than men. By law, employers could pay women less than men for the exact same job during this time. Unfortunately, although these wage codes were abandoned and now everyone under the law should receive equal pay, remnants of these policies from the Great Depression still plague working women in America today. Toward the end of the 1930s, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his New Deal policies began to restore the country to normalcy. Relief packages and regulations allowed the banks to begin to recover and companies to provide more jobs. Then World War II began. Wartime is always lucrative for the United States industries. Businesses ramped up wartime production. This created more jobs and money. Funds from abroad began to flow into the United States economy as foreign nations paid for equipment and products to fight the war. It is sad in a way that war leads to profits, but it may have been what saved the United States from the Great Depression. The 1930s were a rough time in the United States, to say the least. There were practically no high-paying jobs, and the average American lost everything. Without the support of community and relief organizations, millions more would have died. The Great Depression should be a warning that loose regulations and poor government oversight can lead to disaster. Until recent events, the United States economy was growing rapidly. It is eerily similar to the growth that the stock exchange enjoyed during the Roaring '20s. It may be time to take a step back and make sure that banks and businesses are following sustainable practices. Economic growth is not necessarily a precursor to a stock market crash, but it is always good to make sure that stock prices actually reflect the true value of companies instead of an inflated value. Unrealistic stock prices could cause the stock market to pop and crash in the blink of an eye, as it did on Black Thursday. If you live in the US and you're hoping to buy a house in the near future, well, you're out of luck. During the pandemic, there was a mass exodus from cities to the suburbs. People bought their first homes with incredibly low mortgage rates. However, the good times couldn't last, and this high demand for houses led to a severe drop in supply. And when there's a high demand and a low supply, prices go up. This is exactly what happened with the housing market in the United States. But what goes up must come down, and now everyone is waiting for the housing market to crash. Currently, the housing supply continues to shrink in the US, and costs are still rising. This looks to be unsustainable and reminiscent of the housing bubble back in 2008. People are doing crazy things like paying way more than a house is worth just to secure their first home. Others forego inspections to make their offer more appealing to sellers, which oftentimes leaves the buyer with more than they bargained for. These new homeowners are stuck with sagging roofs and entire floors that need to be decontaminated of mold. Overall, it's a big mess. As we come out of the pandemic and into what looks like a looming recession, housing prices are still continuing to rise. This seems crazy as the housing boom has already lasted a few years, and as the economy slows down, housing prices should theoretically decrease. People who thought they were being smart by staying out of the market and waiting for it to crash before buying in are horrified to find that prices likely won't be going down anytime soon. How could the turbulent events of the past few years, ridiculously high inflation, and a slowing economy lead to a housing market that holds its value? The natural assumption is that it can't, and a bubble is about to burst. However, this does not seem to be the case. Most experts agree that we're in uncharted waters, a perfect storm of economic, political, and societal conditions that has led the US housing market to act in some very strange ways. It really did seem that the housing market was about to crash for a while, but then it stabilized and continued to grow. Housing market experts are using terms like abnormal to describe current conditions, but they warn buyers that prices likely won't be coming down anytime soon. There are several reasons for this, and we'll be going through each one. However, you have to keep in mind a few things if you're looking to buy a house in the current market. The first is to keep a level head. Market specialists warn that FOMO, or fear of missing out, is one of the top reasons home buyers make bad decisions. As prices continue to rise, there's a real fear for buyers that they might be priced out of the market. This may be true, but it's also incredibly risky to buy into a market that's at its peak if you don't have a long-term plan. Even though the prices will continue to go up, they will eventually come down, and although this might not be for a while, many buyers who FOMO into buying a house at the wrong time end up regretting it when they can't afford to pay off their mortgage and then find themselves underwater. Let's examine why the housing market hasn't crashed yet, if it will eventually crash, and what home buyers can do to protect themselves from making bad decisions during these uncertain times. We'll start by discussing 4 reasons why housing market specialists believe there hasn't been a crash yet, and why there likely won't be. Reason number 1 why the housing market hasn't crashed. Millennials and Gen Zs are eager to buy their first starter home. Millennials love to blame boomers for many of the problems they're stuck with right now. To be fair, there are certain issues in the United States, such as the failing social security system, huge national debt, and current climate crisis that can mostly all be linked back to the baby boomer generation. However, the current trends in the housing market isn't one of them. And although every generation has made its mistakes and hasn't exactly left the world in a better shape than they found it, the current high prices in the housing market are mainly the result of people in younger generations looking to buy a house all at the same time. Right now, millennials and everyone younger than them make up about half of the population in the United States. This means that there's a huge pool of first-time homebuyers looking to get into the market and secure a house where they can start a family and settle down. There's nothing wrong with this, but due to the pandemic, the number of houses built over the past few years has slowed down dramatically. This is a problem when there are a lot of people looking to buy and new inventory isn't keeping pace with demand. Millennials and Gen Zers all seem to want the same thing at the same time. Obviously, not every single person in these age groups is looking for a house right now, but enough are that housing prices are being influenced in a drastic way. It's the collective desire of younger generations to buy their first home at this moment in time that's pushing prices higher and higher. And this brings us to the next point. Reason 2 why the housing market hasn't crashed? low supply, high demand. A large number of first-time homebuyers looking to get into the market and extremely low inventory due to insufficient supply built in the last 10 years is one of the main factors driving the increase in housing prices. With very high demand from millennials and Gen Z, and low inventory due to fewer houses being constructed, price increases are inevitable. What appears to be a housing market bubble is actually just the work of regular supply and demand. Housing experts have been monitoring the situation closely, and most have come to the same conclusion. Prices will not start decreasing anytime soon. Even with extremely high prices, demand has not seemed to wane very much. The imbalance between the number of houses for sale and the number of people who want to buy them will not change until there's a surplus of supply. Many believe it could take years for enough new houses to be built to reach the amount of demand currently in the marketplace. Until this happens, there's very little chance of a housing market crash. To put things in perspective, a balanced market where supply and demand for houses are about the same is typically indicated by a 6-month buffer. What this means is that in a regular market, inventory should last around 6 months at the prices and buying rate during that time. However, in the current housing market, this metric indicates that there are only 1.7 months of supply, meaning that sellers are in a much better position than buyers. Until the supply catches back up with demand and the inventory can be replenished to the point where there are enough houses on the market to create a surplus, there will be inevitable upward pressure placed on prices. This is why homebuyers are taking out massive mortgages on homes that are worth a lot less a couple years ago. At this point, you have to be wondering if we'll eventually see a repeat of what happened in 2008 when the subprime bubble burst and the housing market collapsed in the US. The answer is probably not because of this next factor. Reason 3 why the housing market hasn't crashed. People likely won't be defaulting on their mortgages this time around. After the mayhem caused by the subprime mortgage crisis between 2007 and 2010 that led to the housing market crash, stricter regulations were put on banks and financial institutions lending out money. These regulations ensure that the loans given out are low risk and that borrowers won't default on their loans all at once. The housing market crashed back in 2008 because banks engaged in shady loaning practices. We know it might be shocking to hear, but financial institutions looking to make a profit often engage in risky behavior unless regulated by a third party such as the government. What happened in 2008 is a perfect example of this. Banks would give out mortgages and home loans with extremely high interest rates to people who were at risk of not being able to pay them back if something went wrong. Then, of course, things went wrong. The economy slowed, and people began defaulting on their loans. Before this happened, the banks were making huge amounts of money from the interest on high-risk loans. However, as workers lost their jobs or just didn't make enough to cover the monthly bills, people started to fall behind on their payments. It was these bad practices used by financial institutions that led to the housing market crash of 2008. This is why the government now has stricter regulations to keep it from happening again. For example, it's incredibly rare to find a reputable financial institution that will give out a loan without doing a background check on the loan holder's finances, income, and job stability. These would all seem like no-brainer things to check when giving out a large sum of money, but this was not always a common practice back in 2007 to 2010. Thankfully, banks seem to be following these rules instead of returning to their old habits. There are now minimum credit scores and down payments that homebuyers need to meet before they'll be cleared for a mortgage, which is another safeguard put in place to prevent another housing market crash. What all this means is that even though some houses require larger mortgages, banks are only lending to people who meet the necessary requirements to ensure they can handle the financial burden. However, these regulations do make it harder for many people to secure loans large enough to buy their dream homes. It's these people who feel they're being priced out of the market, and they're right. A family that's been saving for years to purchase their forever home might now find it's out of reach. And even if they're willing to take on a mortgage with high interest rates, banks might not be willing to give them one. This must be devastating, but it's also one of the reasons why there isn't likely a housing market crash looming on the horizon. As of the last quarter of 2021, 67% of mortgages given out were to borrowers with credit scores over 760, which is considered very good by FICO. People with high credit scores are typically less likely to default on loans and therefore relatively safe for financial institutions to lend money to. Knowing this, housing experts believe that the housing market is in relatively good shape, even as prices continue to increase. That being said, there are several things that could hypothetically lead to a sudden crash, even with all these regulations in place. The scary part is some of them are unfolding before our very eyes. In the United States right now, the economy is in decline. This is due to a number of factors, but high interest rates to battle inflation are one of the main culprits. These protocols have been put into place by the Federal Reserve as inflation rates have reached dangerous levels. However, if not monitored carefully, the high interest rates could stall the economy and cause the U.S. to go into a recession. Many economists think the economy is already there or will be in the very near future. The effect of a recession on the housing market is unpredictable. If the economy slows gradually, the housing market will likely cool off as well. However, if markets plummet and interest rates soar, the housing market will likely crash. Unfortunately, as of right now, there's no way of telling exactly how the economic future of the U.S. will play out. It seems like inflation is gradually slowing down and could be brought under control. And even though the economy is slowing down as well, it'll eventually bounce back. However, there's always the possibility something could go terribly wrong, like a crazy dictator launching a nuke, and the U.S. economy could go into freefall. This would cause the housing market to crash as well. Reason 4 why the housing market hasn't crashed. Mortgage rates are crazy right now, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing for everyone. As of fall 2022, the average 30-year mortgage rate is over 7%, and all indications suggest it'll go higher. In 2020, the average mortgage rate was around 3%. This is a massive jump, and many homeowners refinanced while interest rates were low. This is standard practice and worked out immensely well for anyone who did so. The downside of refinancing at such a low interest rate is now it would be crazy to sell your house and take out a new mortgage at over 7% when you buy a new one. What this means is that there's very little incentive for homeowners to sell right now. This is keeping even more inventory off the market. In turn, people unwilling to sell because of high mortgage rates are exacerbating the supply problem and driving prices even higher. But like all the other factors discussed so far, this will not lead to a housing market crash. What has happened to the U.S. housing market is a series of unfortunate circumstances that have led to skyrocketing prices. Yes, people are being priced out, which is painful for anyone trying to buy a house right now. But since the demand is so high, people are still buying even during these crazy conditions. The reality is that what we see in the U.S. housing market isn't a bubble about to burst, but the natural economic process of supply and demand. So if there isn't going to be a housing market crash in the future, what will happen? Prices will likely continue to increase or stay about the same for the next few years. However, these growth rates cannot be maintained forever, and prices will eventually have to come down. Once there's more supply or demand goes down because prices are just too high, housing prices will decrease. This likely won't result in a crash, but a gradual decline until the market stabilizes. Unfortunately, during this time, there will be people who buy houses at high prices and interest rates that will find themselves in a tough spot as they lose equity. There's a population of first-time homebuyers who don't have a choice but to buy into this market due to life circumstances. These people are buying out of necessity but paying dearly for it. For these individuals, the initial price and mortgage rate will hurt at first. However, if they are in it for the long haul, buyers can refinance their mortgage when interest rates come down, even if they buy at the top of the market. As long as they hold onto their property for long enough, it will most likely appreciate in value, but this is only true if the owner is patient and willing to wait for the right time to sell in the future. A byproduct of the current situation in the housing market, which isn't talked about often, is that it's keeping investors out. When prices are low, housing investors will purchase properties to either renovate and flip or rent out. The problem right now is that recently investors bought a lot of property which they're either using as vacation rentals, leasing to locals, or just leaving the property empty. This can have some nasty consequences for certain areas, such as in the southeastern United States or the Mountain West. And it's in these parts of the country that you'll find some of the highest prices. This is because during and right after the pandemic, investors started buying up homes while mortgage rates were low. At the same time, people with large amounts of disposable income bought properties in these same areas to get away from their hectic lives in the Northeast or Silicon Valley, seeking refuge in the quiet mountains and warm beaches of the Southeast. When this happened, prices in these areas began to climb. In fact, some of the most expensive places in the country to buy a home right now are in these regions because investors and opportunistic home buyers bought up so much inventory during the pandemic. This is not only hurting current home buyers, but it also affects local residents who have lived in these areas their entire lives. As property values go up, so does the cost of living in these regions. And now local residents can't afford to live in their hometowns. This has also been happening around cities and urban centers. Suburbs and smaller towns that were still commutable saw an influx of deep-pocketed homebuyers as corporate employees moved away from the city life and into more rural areas. This isn't always a bad thing, but the fact that it happened so quickly and in large numbers is one of the main reasons why prices increased so much over the last year in certain parts of the country. Now people who are trying to make similar moves on a modest budget can't afford to buy anything in these areas because there's practically no inventory, and what is available is grossly overpriced. The other side of this predicament is that since areas of the mountain states in the southeast experienced such a high influx of buyers early on that drove prices up, these parts of the countries will be hit the hardest when the housing markets start to cool. Therefore, if you're looking to buy a house in the Mountain West or southeastern US, please beware. We will say this again because it is very important. If you're looking to buy a house in the mountain states, the southeast like Florida, or the suburbs of any major metropolitan area, please be careful. The housing market will cool off even in the best of circumstances, but it also might crash hard, especially in these places where housing prices have become inflated. If you're able to wait for several years before buying a new house, this is likely your best bet, as mortgage rates and prices will both eventually go down. If you cannot wait that long, just make sure you have a long-term plan and won't be severely affected when prices fluctuate. As was mentioned before, we're in uncertain times. Everything that's going on in the housing market and the economy has never happened at the current scale. So it's very hard to predict what the future will hold. That being said, prices will almost certainly continue to rise in the United States, at least for a while, due to the still high demand and a low supply of houses. Inevitably, prices will drop back down to reasonable levels. This could happen gradually, or if the economy tanks and people lose their jobs, there could be a crash. It's impossible to tell which scenario will occur, but the best guess anyone has right now is that we're likely headed toward a slow decline in prices over the next 2 to 5 years, until enough new houses can be built, or investors who are hoarding houses put some back on the market to meet the demands of new millennial and Gen Z homebuyers. Prices will continue to rise, and since U.S. housing companies have a lot of catching up to do on the supply side of things, it could be a long time before a decrease in housing prices happen. Now watch What If the U.S. Economy Crashes? Or check out $1 million will get you a house like this around the world.